The cold came first, the way it always did in Wyoming come November. Not the gentle cold of autumn mornings, but the bone-deep kind that settled into a man's joints and reminded him he was closer to the end than the beginning. Carter Wright woke at 5:43 in the morning, same as he had every morning for the past 3 years, in a trailer that leaked heat faster than a sieve leaked water. 58 years old and sleeping in a metal box on the edge of someone else's land. This was what redemption looked like, apparently. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the photograph taped to the wall opposite. The tape had yellowed and curled at the edges, but the image remained clear. A girl, 16 years old, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, green eyes bright with something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. Carter had stopped being able to tell the difference. Kellyanne Wright, born March 7, 1985, died November 12, 2001. The official report said vehicular accident, single-car collision, lost control on a wet road, died on impact. Clean, simple, a lie. Carter's hands shook as he reached for the coffee pot, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. On the small folding table beside the hot plate sat a 2-year sobriety chip from Alcoholics Anonymous, bronze-colored and worn smooth from being turned over in his fingers during the hard moments. Next to it, a half-empty bottle of Jim Beam he kept as a test. Every morning the same choice. Every morning so far the same answer. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and didn't look at the whiskey. The voiceover in his head, the one that sounded like a prosecutor reading charges, started its familiar litany. They say time heals. They're liars. Time doesn't heal anything. Time just teaches you to function around the hole, the same way a tree grows around a fence post. The damage remains. You just get used to working around it. Carter dressed in the dark, layers against the cold. Thermal underwear that had seen better decades, flannel shirt with one elbow patch, denim jacket with the other elbow patch, and work boots with soles he'd re-glued himself. The limp in his left leg announced itself as he stood, an old construction injury from before, from the life he'd had when he was someone else. He ignored it the way he ignored most pain. Acknowledgement only made it worse. Outside, the world existed in shades of gray. Pre-dawn light the color of old steel, frost covering everything in a brittle shell. The Brennan Ranch spread out before him, 2,000 acres of Wyoming grassland and rocky outcrops, mountains rising in the distance like the broken teeth of something ancient and unforgiving. Beautiful in the way a graveyard is beautiful. Peaceful because everything in it is dead or dying. Frank Brennan's ranch house sat 300 yards away, a structure that had weathered 70 years of Wyoming winters and looked like it could weather 70 more. Lights already on in the kitchen. Frank would be up, had probably been up for an hour, drinking his own coffee and reading the news on a tablet his daughter had given him that he claimed to hate, but checked obsessively. 78 years old and dying of cancer he refused to treat, but still ran his ranch like a Marine ran a forward operating base. Carter began his morning routine. Check the fence line, same as every morning. Frank's orders from 3 years ago, unchanged. Walk the northern perimeter, look for breaks, fix what you find, report what you can't fix. Simple work. Mindless work. The kind of work that kept a man from thinking too much about the choices that had led him to a trailer on someone else's land. The fence ran for miles, barbed wire strung between posts that Carter himself had replaced over the past 3 years. Honest work. The kind of work his grandfather would have approved of, back when Carter's grandfather had still been alive, and Carter had still been someone worth approving of. He carried his tool belt, wire cutters, and pliers and staples, coffee cooling in a thermos in his coat pocket. The sun began its slow climb, turning the gray world bronze, then gold. Carter's breath formed clouds that dissipated as quickly as hope. His boots crunched through frost-covered grass, following the fence line north toward the mountains, toward the national forest land that bordered Brennan's property. This was his life now. This was his penance. The sound reached him around 7:15, just as full daylight broke over the mountains. At first, he thought it was wind, the way wind sounds when it moves through pine trees, a low moan that could be mistaken for morning. But there was something else underneath it, something that made Carter's heart rate pick up in a way he hadn't felt since Vietnam. Something alive, something suffering. He stopped walking, cocked his head, listened. The sound came again, clearer now. Not wind, breathing, labored, desperate breathing, the kind that came from a body pushed past its limits and still refusing to quit. And underneath that, a sound Carter recognized from 1,000 construction sites. Metal scraping against something hard, chain against bone. His first instinct was to walk away. Not my problem, not my business. Whatever was out there in the forest had nothing to do with him. He had enough weight to carry without adding someone else's trouble to the load. But even as the thought formed, his feet were already moving, following the sound deeper into the trees. The fence line ended at the forest boundary, and Carter stepped over it without hesitation. Private property laws meant nothing to a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. The breathing grew louder with each step, accompanied now by a wet, rattling quality that Carter had heard before, in field hospitals and emergency rooms. The sound of a body drowning in its own fluids. He pushed through a thick stand of serviceberry bushes, their branches catching at his jacket, and emerged into a small clearing dominated by an oak tree that must have been standing since before Wyoming was a state. What he saw there made his blood run cold in a way the November air never could. Collapsed at the base of the tree was the largest horse Carter had ever seen. 18 hands high at least, maybe more, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. But it was the chains that made Carter's stomach lurch. Heavy gauge chains, the kind used for towing trucks, wrapped around the horse's neck and body, securing it to the massive oak like some medieval prisoner. The metal had cut deep into the animal's hide, creating wounds that wept fluid the color of infection. Blood and pus had crusted in the horse's coat, attracting flies despite the cold. The horse's breathing was shallow and irregular, each exhale creating a small cloud of vapor that hung in the air for a moment before dissipating. Its ribs showed starkly beneath the black coat, every bone clearly defined. This animal hadn't eaten properly in weeks, maybe longer. One massive hoof scraped weakly at the frozen ground, the only sign that it was still fighting to survive. Carter stood motionless, taking in the scene with the clinical detachment of a man who'd seen too much suffering to be shocked by it anymore. But then the horse turned its head, just slightly, and looked directly at him. The eyes were the color of amber, golden brown and clear despite the horse's condition. Intelligent eyes, aware eyes, eyes that asked a question Carter had heard before, in his daughter's voice on a phone call he'd been too drunk to answer. "Are you here to help, or are you here to watch me die?" Carter's hands clenched into fists. God damn it to hell. He approached slowly, hands visible, the way you approach any wounded animal. The horse didn't try to move, conserving what little strength it had left. Up close, the damage was even worse. The chains had been wrapped around the animal multiple times, creating a web of metal that would be impossible to slip out of even for a horse this size. Whoever had done this had known what they were doing. This wasn't accidental, this was deliberate. A piece of paper was tied to the chain around the horse's neck, water-stained and barely legible. Carter untied it with fingers that had gone numb, though whether from cold or rage he couldn't say. He unfolded the note and squinted at the hastily scrawled words. "His name is Goliath. Debt paid. If he lives, he's yours. If not, bury him deep. W.H." Carter read it twice, then a third time, his brain trying to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. Debt paid. This wasn't abandonment. It had become an abandonment. This was collateral. Someone had chained this animal to a tree as payment for something and then walked away hoping nature would do what they didn't have the spine to do themselves. He looked at the horse again, at Goliath, and saw his daughter's eyes looking back at him. Same color, same desperate intelligence, same unspoken question. His first instinct was still to walk away. He was 58 years old, barely scraping by on the wages Frank paid him, living in a trailer that would probably collapse in the next serious windstorm. He didn't have the money to save a houseplant, let alone a 1,000-pound animal that looked like it was already halfway to the grave. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to call the sheriff's office and let them deal with it. Animal control would come out, assess the situation, and probably decide the kindest thing would be a bullet behind the ear. Carter stood there for a long moment, Wyoming wind cutting through his jacket, staring into those amber eyes. God damn it. He turned and started walking back toward the ranch, not looking back, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. But even as he walked, he knew he was coming back. Knew it with the same certainty he knew the sun would set tonight and rise again tomorrow. Because those eyes were Kelly's eyes, and he'd walked away from Kelly when she needed him, and he'd been paying for it every day since. Some debts you can't ever settle, but that doesn't mean you stop trying. Carter made it back to his trailer in under 15 minutes, moving faster than his bad knee appreciated. He gathered tools with the efficiency of a man who'd spent 40 years doing hard labor. Bolt cutters, the heavy-duty kind used for cutting rebar, hacksaw with fresh blades, pry bar, wire cutters, a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for the day he finally quit fighting and gave in. The horse would need it more than he did. He loaded everything into a canvas bag, added a canteen of water and some old towels, and headed back into the forest. The sun was higher now, but the temperature hadn't risen. If anything, it felt colder. Carter's breath came in harsh gasps by the time he reached the clearing again, his knees screaming with every step. 58 years old and already falling apart, but still moving, still refusing to quit. Goliath hadn't moved, but his eyes tracked Carter's approach. No fear in them now, just exhaustion and something that might have been resignation. The horse had probably been waiting to die, had maybe even welcomed it, until someone showed up and complicated things. Carter set down his bag and circled the tree, assessing the situation from every angle. The chains had been wrapped around Goliath's neck and chest in multiple layers, secured with a heavy-duty padlock that looked like it would take a cutting torch to break. But the chains themselves were old, the kind that had been sitting in someone's garage for years, weathered and corroded. That was something. Carter had cut through worse. He started with the bolt cutters, positioning them on a link in the chain around Goliath's chest. The horse flinched at the metallic click, but didn't try to move away. Carter put his full weight on the handles, feeling the resistance, feeling his muscles strain against physics and rust. The link held. He repositioned, tried again, still held. On the third attempt, something in his lower back popped, and pain shot up his spine like electricity, but the link gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the clearing. One link down, approximately 40 to go. The work was brutal. Each link required multiple attempts. Each attempt sent shockwaves through Carter's arms and back. Sweat soaked through his thermal layer despite the cold, and his hands began to blister inside his work gloves. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because this was the first thing in 3 years that had felt like it mattered. Goliath watched him work with those intelligent amber eyes, and Carter found himself talking to the horse in a low, steady voice, the way his grandfather used to talk to spooked cattle back when Carter was young enough to believe the world made sense. I don't know who did this to you. Don't much care, if I'm being honest. What matters is getting you out. Got a place not too far from here. Small barn, hasn't had a horse in it for years, but it's got walls and a roof and hay that's probably only half rotten. Water's good. Stream runs through the property. Doesn't freeze till January. You make it through today, you'll make it through winter. The horse didn't respond, but his ear flickered toward Carter's voice, and that was enough. Around chain number 8, Goliath began to struggle, not trying to escape, just shifting his weight, testing his range of motion as the metal web around him began to loosen. Carter stopped immediately, afraid the animal would injure itself further. He could see where the chains had cut into Goliath's hide, see exposed muscle in places, see infection setting in around the wounds. This horse should have been dead already, should have died days ago. The fact that he was still breathing was either a miracle or a curse, and Carter had stopped believing in miracles somewhere around his daughter's funeral. Easy, boy, easy now. I know it hurts. I know you want this done, but if you thrash around, you'll make it worse. Just give me time. I got nothing but time. It was a lie, but a useful one. Frank would be expecting him back by noon with a report on the fence line. When Carter didn't show, Frank would come looking, or more likely send someone to fire him for abandoning his post. But that was a problem for future Carter. Present Carter had a more immediate concern in the form of a dying horse and 40 more chains to cut. The sun climbed higher. Carter's back screamed. His hands bled inside his gloves. The bolt cutter slipped twice, the second time catching his thumb hard enough to split the nail. He wrapped it in a towel and kept working. Around chain 20, the hacksaw blade snapped. Carter had anticipated this, had brought 3 spare blades, but changing them out required stopping, and stopping allowed the reality of the situation to seep in. He was an alcoholic Vietnam vet with bad knees and worse judgment, trying to save a horse that had been left to die by someone who clearly had the resources to chain it up in the first place. For all Carter knew, whoever had done this was coming back. For all he knew, this was some kind of criminal operation, and he was inserting himself into something that would end with him face down in the forest. He looked at Goliath, at those amber eyes, and thought about his daughter. Kelly had called him the night she died, 3 times. He'd been passed out drunk on the couch, phone buzzing on the coffee table 2 feet away, and he'd been too far gone to hear it. By the time he woke up the next morning, head pounding and mouth tasting like he'd been chewing on dirt, the police were already at his door. Single car accident, lost control, died on impact, and a voicemail he'd never listened to because he knew what would be in it and he couldn't face it. Carter fitted a new blade into the hacksaw and went back to work. By the time the last chain fell away with a metallic clang that seemed to echo forever, 4 hours had passed and Carter could barely stand. His back was locked up, his hands were destroyed, and his knee had swollen so badly he could feel it pressing against the inside of his jeans. But Goliath was free. The great horse didn't immediately try to rise. Instead, he lay there in the dirt and dead leaves, breathing hard, as if he couldn't quite believe the weight was gone. Carter sat down heavily beside him, too exhausted to do anything else, and waited. They stayed like that for maybe 15 minutes, man and horse, both of them bloodied and used up, both of them still breathing. Then Goliath made his first attempt to stand. His legs buckled immediately. 3 weeks, maybe a month of being chained in one position had atrophied the muscles, locked up the joints. The horse went down hard, and Carter heard something crack that might have been a branch or might have been bone. Goliath's eyes went wide with something that looked like panic. Carter pulled himself upright, every joint protesting, and moved to the horse's head. He knelt down, ignoring the scream from his knee, and placed one hand on Goliath's neck. "Not yet. You don't get to give up yet. One more try." The horse looked at him with those amber eyes, and Carter saw something shift in them. Recognition, maybe. Or just stubbornness. The same stubborn refusal to quit that had kept Carter sober for 2 years and kept Goliath breathing for 3 weeks chained to a tree. Goliath gathered himself and tried again. This time his front legs held. His back legs shook like saplings in a storm, but they held. Slowly, carefully, the great black horse heaved himself upright and stood swaying in the clearing, head lowered, breathing like he'd just run a race, but standing, alive, free. Carter stood too, using the tree trunk for support, and for the first time in 3 years felt something other than the constant gray weight of guilt and regret. He felt something that might have been hope, or might have just been the satisfaction of fixing something, instead of breaking it. "Come on, Goliath, let's go home." The walk back to the ranch should have taken 20 minutes. It took nearly 3 hours. Goliath could only manage a few dozen steps before needing to rest, his weakened body unable to sustain even minimal exertion. Each time he stopped, Carter stopped with him, not pushing, just waiting. The horse's breathing would slow, his legs would stop shaking quite so badly, and then he'd take another few steps. Progress measured in feet rather than miles. More than once, Carter wondered if he was watching the animal's final journey rather than a rescue. Goliath fell twice, going down to his knees and staying there for long minutes, while Carter's heart hammered in his chest. But each time, the horse struggled back to his feet and kept moving. The sun had passed its zenith and started its descent toward the western mountains when they finally emerged from the forest and Goliath saw the ranch spread out before him. Carter watched the horse's reaction, saw his head come up higher than it had been, saw his ears prick forward. Not recognition of this specific place, but recognition of what it represented: shelter, water, food, safety, a chance. The final 100 yards were the longest. Goliath was moving on pure will now, legs barely functioning, but still refusing to stop. Carter walked beside him, one hand resting lightly on the horse's shoulder, and found himself making promises he had no business making. "You're going to make it. I don't care what it takes or what it costs. You're going to make it because I say so, and I'm too mean and too stubborn to let you quit now." They reached the barn as the sun touched the mountains. The structure was old, built in the same era as Frank's house, with good bones but decades of deferred maintenance. Carter had patched the worst of the holes over the past 3 years, replaced rotted boards, shored up the foundation. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. He led Goliath inside, into a stall he'd cleaned out just last week during a fit of productive avoidance. Fresh straw on the floor, water trough that Carter filled from the hose, hay rack empty, but fixable. Goliath walked into the stall like he was walking into a cathedral, turned in a careful circle, and then finally lowered himself to the straw-covered floor with a groan that sounded almost human. Carter stood at the stall door, watching the great horse's sides rise and fall, counting breaths to make sure they stayed regular. He should go tell Frank what he'd found, should call a vet, should do any number of practical, responsible things. Instead, he found an old bucket, filled it with water, and set it within reach of Goliath's head. Then he sat down on an overturned feed bucket and just watched. The light through this barn's high windows turned gold, then red, then purple. Shadows lengthened. The temperature dropped. Carter didn't move. He'd spent 3 years avoiding stillness, avoiding the quiet moments when memory could catch up to him. But sitting here, watching this broken animal breathe, he found a different kind of quiet. Not peace, not forgiveness. Just the simple fact of presence. The sound of boots on gravel pulled him back to reality. Carter looked up to see Frank Brennan standing in the barn doorway, backlit by the last light of day, shotgun cradled in the crook of his arm the way other men carried briefcases. Frank was 70, 80 years old and looked like something carved from the same stone as the mountains. Weathered face, gray crew cut, eyes the color of winter ice. Korean War veteran. Widowed 20 years, one daughter who called twice a month from Seattle and visited never. He ran his ranch alone except for Carter, refusing help the way he refused cancer treatment, on the principle that a man handled his own problems. He studied the scene for a long moment. Carter sitting on a bucket, covered in blood and dirt. The enormous black horse collapsed in the stall. The chains piled in the corner where Carter had dropped them. "Where you been, right?" Carter stood, his knee nearly giving out, and met Frank's gaze directly. Found a horse, chained up in the forest past the north fence line. Brought him back. Frank's expression didn't change. Not our problem. It is now. Something shifted in Frank's eyes. Some calculation or assessment happening behind that weathered face. He walked into the barn, moving with the careful precision of a man who knew his body was failing, but refused to acknowledge it. He approached Goliath's stall, looked at the horse for a long moment, then looked back at Carter. "You got 3 days to get him stable. After that, he goes to auction or glue factory. Your choice." Carter opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Frank Brennan didn't make idle threats. If Carter couldn't prove Goliath was worth the resources in 3 days, the horse would be gone. It was more of a chance than Carter had expected. Fair enough. Frank turned to leave, then paused at the barn door. "One more thing. You abandon your post again without telling me, you're fired. I don't care if you're rescuing the president's horse. You work for me. You follow my rules." "Understood." Frank nodded once and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Carter alone with Goliath and the rapidly approaching night. Carter should have gone back to his trailer, should have cleaned up, eaten something, maybe tried to sleep. Instead, he stayed in the barn, checking Goliath's breathing every few minutes, adjusting the position of the water bucket, spreading more straw to provide better cushioning. The horse's eyes were half closed but aware, tracking Carter's movements with that unsettling intelligence. Around midnight, when the temperature had dropped below freezing and Carter's hands were so cold he could barely feel them, he finally allowed himself to acknowledge what he was doing. He was caring for something, taking responsibility for a life other than his own. For the first time since Kelly's death, he was choosing to save something instead of just watching it die. He sat down with his back against the barn wall, pulled his jacket tighter, and let himself look at the truth he'd been avoiding all day. This horse was going to die. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The damage was too severe, the infection too advanced, the malnutrition too extreme. Any competent veterinarian would take one look and recommend euthanasia. 3 days wouldn't be enough to change that. But Carter had learned something in his 2 years of sobriety, something the AA meetings had drilled into him through repetition and ritual. You don't save yourself all at once. You save yourself one day at a time, one choice at a time, one refusal to quit at a time. Maybe horses work the same way. Goliath's breathing changed. It became more shallow, more irregular. Carter was on his feet immediately, moving to the stall door, heart hammering. The horse's eyes had opened fully and were rolling with what looked like panic. His body shuddered, legs kicking weakly at the straw. No, not yet, not after everything. Carter didn't think, just moved. He opened the stall door, knelt beside Goliath's massive head, and placed both hands on the horse's neck. He could feel the elevated heart rate, feel the heat of infection radiating from the wounds, feel the tremors running through the animal's body. And then, operating on pure instinct and half-remembered training from a CPR class he'd taken 30 years ago, Carter began to press rhythmically on Goliath's chest, counting compressions, trying to stabilize the erratic breathing. It was absurd. You couldn't perform CPR on a horse. The anatomy was wrong, the scale was wrong, everything about it was wrong. But Goliath's breathing began to slow, to deepen, to regulate. The panic in his eyes faded, replaced by exhaustion. Carter kept his hands in place, kept the steady pressure, and whispered the same thing over and over like a prayer. Not yet, not yet, not yet. After what might have been 5 minutes or might have been an hour, Goliath's breathing settled into something approaching normal. His eyes closed again, and the tension went out of his body, sleeping or unconscious, or just too tired to fight anymore. Carter sat back on his heels, his own heart racing, his hands shaking. He looked down at the great black horse and spoke the first completely honest words he'd said to another living thing in 3 years. You owe me now. You hear me? You owe me, so you don't get to die. He stayed in the barn all night, dozing fitfully against the wall, waking every time Goliath's breathing changed. By the time gray light began to seep through the barn's high windows, Carter had made a decision. He didn't have money for a vet, didn't have resources to save this horse, didn't have any reasonable expectation of success. But he also didn't have anything to lose anymore. And sometimes when you've got nothing left, that's the closest thing to freedom you'll ever find. The sun rose on Carter's second day with Goliath, and he got to work. Dawn broke cold and unforgiving over the Brennan Ranch, the kind of morning that made a man question whether Wyoming was fit for human habitation. Carter Wright had been awake for 2 hours already, watching the sky turn from black to gray to that pale blue that promised nothing but more cold. Goliath had made it through the night, which counted as a victory even if it was a small one. The horse's breathing was steadier now, less of that wet rattle that spoke of lungs filling with fluid. His eyes, when they opened, tracked Carter's movements with increasing awareness. 3 days, Frank had said. 3 days to prove this animal was worth keeping alive. Carter had 48 hours left. He stood in the barn doorway, coffee in hand, and watched the sun climb over the eastern mountains. His body felt like it had been run through a wood chipper. Back muscles screamed with every movement. Hands were wrapped in bandages that were already seeping blood. The knee that had been bad before yesterday was now something approaching catastrophic. But pain was just information, and the information it provided was simple. He was still alive, still moving, still capable of work. The ranch wouldn't run itself while he played nursemaid to a dying horse. Carter checked Goliath one more time, refilled his water, left a small amount of hay within reach. The horse watched him with those amber eyes, but didn't try to eat, too weak or too smart to risk putting anything in a stomach that hadn't processed food in weeks. Carter made a mental note to call someone about that if he could figure out who to call and how to pay for it. He grabbed his tool belt and headed out to do the work Frank actually paid him for. The fence line stretched for miles in every direction, a spider web of wire and wood posts holding back the wilderness. Carter walked it with the methodical precision of a man who understood that details mattered. A loose wire here, a rotted post there, small problems that became big problems if you ignored them long enough. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Watching his marriage collapse one ignored argument at a time, watching his daughter drift away, one missed dinner at a time. Some things you couldn't fix after they broke, but fence wire at least was forgiving. He worked through this morning, tightening wire, replacing staples, marking posts that would need replacing before winter really set in. The physical labor felt good, felt like penance in a way that simply existing never could. Sweat and blood and the satisfaction of making something better than it was when you found it. This was honest work, the kind of work that used to mean something before the world got complicated. Around 10 in the morning, a truck pulled up to where Carter was working. Not Frank's truck. This one was newer, cleaner with medical insignia on the door. A woman climbed out, somewhere in her early 60s, wearing work clothes that had actually seen work. She pulled a medical bag from the truck bed and walked toward him with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't need anyone's permission to do it. "You must be Carter Wright," Frank called. "Said you found a horse that needed looking at." Carter straightened, feeling his back protest. "You the vet?" "Reverend Sarah Garrett, also the vet. We multitask out here." She said it without a trace of humor, just stating facts. Carter liked her immediately. "He's in the barn. Fair warning, he's in bad shape. That's why I'm here." They walked back to the ranch in silence, Carter limping slightly, Sarah matching his pace without comment. She moved like someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating rough terrain, steady and sure-footed. When they reached the barn and she saw Goliath, her expression didn't change. She just set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Carter watched as she examined the horse with clinical efficiency, checked his eyes, his gums, his heart rate, ran her hands over the wounds where the chains had cut deep, probing the infected tissue without flinching. Goliath tolerated the examination with the patience of an animal too tired to resist. After 20 minutes, Sarah sat back on her heels and looked at Carter. "This horse should be dead." Carter said nothing, just waited. Sarah pulled a notebook from her bag and started writing. Severe malnutrition, multiple infected lacerations, possible internal injuries from the restraints, dehydration, muscle atrophy from prolonged immobilization. She looked up. "You want the survival rate?" "Not particularly. 30%. Maybe, and that's if we start treatment immediately, which means antibiotics, IV fluids, specialized feed, wound care twice daily. We're looking at $6,000 minimum and months of intensive care." Carter felt something cold settle in his stomach. His bank account had $400 in it. Maybe. What if we don't do all that? Then he dies. Probably within the week. Could be as soon as tonight if infection gets into his bloodstream. They stood there in the barn, morning light streaming through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the air. Carter looked at Goliath, at those amber eyes that reminded him so much of Kelly's. He thought about the easy path, the practical path. One bullet, 1 second, and the horse's suffering would be over. No $6,000, no months of work, no risk of failing again at something that mattered. "What's the first step?" Carter asked. Sarah studied him for a long moment. "You understand what you're signing up for. This isn't like nursing a sick dog. This is going to consume your life for the foreseeable future." "What's the first step?" Sarah pulled supplies from her bag. "Antibiotics, broad spectrum, and we need to clean those wounds properly before infection spreads." The next 2 hours were brutal. Cleaning the wounds required removing the crusted blood and pus, exposing raw tissue, irrigating with antiseptic that made Goliath shudder despite his exhaustion. Sarah worked with the efficiency of long practice, but her face was grim. Carter held Goliath's head, talking to him in a low, steady voice, the same way he'd talked himself through the worst of withdrawal. "You're tougher than this. You've survived everything they threw at you so far. A little disinfectant isn't going to be what takes you down." When they finished, Sarah loaded a syringe with antibiotics and administered the injection. Goliath barely reacted. "That'll help with the infection, but he needs fluids, and he needs food." Her voice was matter-of-fact. "The antibiotics bought you time, not a cure." "How much time?" "Could be days, could be hours." She packed up her supplies. "I'll come back tomorrow. Same time." "And Carter," she paused at the barn door, "I'm not charging you my normal rate for this." "Why not?" "Because Frank Brennan called in a favor. Said you were doing something worth supporting." She looked at Goliath, then back at Carter. "But this only works if you do your part. That means following my instructions exactly. No shortcuts. No giving up when it gets hard." "I don't give up." "Everyone says that. We'll see if you mean it." She left, and Carter was alone with Goliath again. He sat down on the overturned bucket, feeling every one of his 58 years, and tried to do the math. $6,000, months of care. He made $1,200 a month working for Frank, most of which went to basic survival. Trailer rent, food, gas for his truck. The sobriety chip in his pocket suddenly felt heavier. 2 years without a drink. 2 years of saving every penny he didn't absolutely need to spend. He had $847 in savings. Not nearly enough. Carter looked at Goliath, at the steady rise and fall of the horse's chest, and made a decision. He couldn't afford to save this animal, but he couldn't afford not to try either. Some things weren't about money. They were about whether you could still look at yourself in the mirror. He spent the afternoon doing what he always did when the world became too much. He worked, mucked out the stall, spread fresh straw, repaired the water trough so it wouldn't leak, fixed a broken board in the barn wall. Small things, things he could control. By the time the sun started setting, he'd transformed the barn from a forgotten storage space into something that could actually house a horse long term. Frank appeared as Carter was finishing, materializing out of the gathering darkness like a ghost. The old man stood in the doorway, watching Carter work, saying nothing for a long time. "Sarah says you're trying to save that horse." Trying being the operative word. Frank walked into the barn, his boots hollow on the worn wood floor. He studied Goliath with the practiced eye of a man who'd been around horses his entire life. Says he's got a 30% chance. That's what she said. "You got a plan for coming up with $6,000? Carter hammered in a final nail, then set down his tools. Working on it. Frank was quiet for another long moment. Then he pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and tossed it on a hay bale. "That's your new wage. Went up $200 a month. Backdated to when you started. Call it payment for horse management." Carter stared at the envelope without touching it. He knew what Frank was doing. Charity dressed up as business, a way to help without either of them having to acknowledge what was happening. "I don't need charity." Frank's expression didn't change. "It's not charity, it's a wager." Carter looked up at that. "What kind of wager?" "You save that horse, prove you can run this operation properly, and the ranch is yours when I die. You fail, you're just another hired hand who'll be out of a job when I'm in the ground." Carter felt something shift in his chest. "Why would you do that?" Frank turned toward the door, his silhouette dark against the dying light. "Because I'm 78 years old and dying of cancer, and I need to see if modern men still have what it takes to earn something instead of just expecting it to be handed to them." He paused. 3 years ago, I bet you'd quit within a week. You proved me wrong. Now let's see if you can do it again." He walked out, leaving Carter alone with Goliath in an envelope full of money that represented something more than wages. It represented a test, a challenge, a chance to prove that broken men could still build something worth leaving behind. Carter opened the envelope. There were 3 checks inside, each for $200, backdated over the past 3 months. $600. Combined with his savings, that gave him $1,447. Still not enough, but closer. Possible maybe if he could stretch it far enough. He looked at Goliath. "Looks like we both got something to prove now." The horse's ear flickered toward his voice, and Carter allowed himself to believe that meant something. The next week became a blur of work and worry. Carter established a routine that would have killed a younger man and was doing its level best to kill him. Up at 4 in the morning to check Goliath's condition, change his bandages, clean his wounds. 5 to noon, ranch work, because Frank's test or not, the fence still needed walking and the equipment still needed maintaining. Noon to 1, force-feeding Goliath small amounts of grain mixed with supplements Sarah had recommended, coaxing water into him tablespoon by tablespoon. 1 to 8, more ranch work, pushing his body past exhaustion because exhaustion meant he couldn't think about how impossible this all was. 8 to 10, Goliath's physical therapy, walking him in slow circles around the barn to rebuild the atrophied muscles. 10 to midnight, collapse in his trailer and try to sleep before starting over. The only time Carter deviated from the routine was Tuesday mornings, when he drove into town for the AA meeting in the basement of the Methodist church. He'd been attending for 2 years, ever since the judge had made it a condition of his probation for the DUI that had finally convinced him sobriety wasn't optional anymore. Most of the faces were familiar by now. Bill, the insurance adjuster who had lost his family to drinking. Margaret, the retired teacher who'd hidden vodka in her desk drawer for a decade. Tommy, the kid who was barely 20 and already looked 50, from meth and whatever else he could get his hands on. They sat in a circle on folding chairs and talked about their struggles with the kind of honesty that was only possible when everyone in the room understood what it meant to hit bottom. When it was Carter's turn to share, he kept it brief. Still sober. 2 years, 3 months. Working on something that matters for the first time in a long time. Trying not to screw it up. Bill nodded. "That's all any of us can do, brother. One day at a time." After the meeting, Carter stood in the parking lot, keys in hand, and looked at the bar across the street. 2 years, 3 months, and the thirst never really went away. It just became something you lived with, like the limp in his knee or the scar on his chin. A permanent reminder of who you used to be. He drove back to the ranch and checked on Goliath. By the end of the first week, the horse was standing more often than lying down. By the end of the second week, he was eating small amounts without Carter having to force feed him. The wounds were healing slowly, forming thick scabs that Sarah said were healthy signs. The infection was retreating, driven back by antibiotics and stubborn refusal to quit. Carter watched the transformation with something approaching awe. This animal should have died a dozen times over, should have given up when the chains cut into his flesh, or when starvation hollowed out his body, or when Carter's inexperienced hands had probably caused more pain than help in those first brutal days. But Goliath refused to die, refused to quit, just kept breathing, kept eating, kept taking one more step, even when his legs shook like they'd give out any second. It was the most honest thing Carter had ever witnessed. On a Saturday morning 3 weeks after finding Goliath, Carter was working in the barn when he heard a vehicle pull up outside. Not Frank's truck and not Sarah's. This was something smaller, newer, with an engine that purred instead of growled. He walked out to find a woman and a young girl standing beside a compact SUV, both of them looking uncertain. The woman was maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of tired eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. The girl was 8 or 9, clutching a stuffed animal and standing so close to her mother they might have been glued together. "Can I help you?" Carter kept his voice neutral, not welcoming, but not hostile. The woman spoke, her voice hesitant. "We're looking for Carter Wright. Are you him?" "Depends on why you're asking." "My name is Rachel Martinez. This is my daughter Mia." She gestured to the girl who was staring at her shoes. "We heard about the horse, the one you rescued." Carter felt something tighten in his chest. "News travels fast in small towns," Rachel continued. "I know this is probably strange, but we drove 3 hours to get here. My daughter, she has severe anxiety, won't talk to strangers, barely leaves the house. But when she heard about your horse, she asked if we could come see him. First time she's asked to do anything in months." Carter looked at the girl, at the way she was hiding behind her mother, at the death grip she had on that stuffed animal. He saw his daughter at that age, before the world had broken her, before he'd failed to catch her when she fell. "Horse isn't a petting zoo. He's recovering from serious injuries." "I understand." Rachel's voice was quiet but firm. "But if you could just let her see him, even from a distance, it would mean everything." Carter wanted to say no, wanted to explain that Goliath was still weak, still skittish, still dealing with trauma that made unpredictable behavior a real possibility. But he looked at that little girl and thought about second chances, about how everyone deserved them, even scared kids and broken horses and washed-up drunks. 5 minutes, and you stay outside the stall." They followed him into the barn, the girl's footsteps so quiet Carter had to check to make sure she was still there. Goliath was standing in his stall, head lowered, dozing in a patch of sunlight. When he heard them approaching, his head came up, ears forward. And then something remarkable happened. Goliath walked to the front of his stall and lowered his massive head until it was level with the girl's. Just looked at her with those amber eyes, completely still, as if he understood that sudden movements would terrify her. Mia stopped walking, stopped breathing it seemed like, just stared at this enormous black horse who was staring back at her with infinite patience. Slowly, so slowly Carter barely saw it happen, the girl reached through the stall bars and touched Goliath's nose. The horse didn't move, didn't flinch, just accepted the touch like it was the most natural thing in the world. Mia whispered something too quiet for anyone to hear, but Goliath's ear flickered toward the sound, and the girl's face transformed. The fear didn't disappear, but something else appeared alongside it. Wonder, maybe, or hope. They stayed like that for maybe 2 minutes. Then Mia stepped back, looked up at Carter with eyes that were a little less haunted than when she'd arrived, and whispered again, "Thank you." Rachel was crying quietly, one hand over her mouth. She mouthed the words "thank you" to Carter, who didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded. After they left, Carter stood in the barn and tried to process what had just happened. He'd rescued Goliath to save himself. Or maybe because he couldn't bear the thought of walking away from those amber eyes. But the horse had just done something that had nothing to do with Carter, had reached out to a frightened child and offered comfort without being asked, without expecting anything in return. Sarah was right. This wasn't just an animal. This was something more. The next Saturday, Rachel and Mia came back, and the Saturday after that. Each time, the girl spent a little longer with Goliath, talked a little more, smiled a little easier. By the fourth visit, she was brushing his mane while telling him stories in a voice that was gaining strength with every word. Rachel pulled Carter aside during that visit, tears in her eyes again. "I don't know how to thank you. My daughter hasn't spoken above a whisper to anyone outside family since the divorce. But with him, she laughs, she talks, she's becoming herself again." Carter didn't know what to say to that, so he said what he always said when confronted with things he didn't understand. "He's a good horse. He's a miracle." After they left that day, Carter sat with Goliath and thought about miracles. Thought about how he'd stumbled across this animal by accident, or maybe by design, depending on whether you believed the universe had a plan. Thought about how saving Goliath was teaching him something he'd forgotten. That value wasn't measured in dollars or achievements. It was measured in moments, in small acts of kindness that rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict or control. A truck pulled up outside and Carter recognized the sound of the engine before he saw it. Frank's truck, which meant Frank had something to say. The old man walked into the barn, moving slower than he had a month ago. The cancer was advancing, eating away at him from the inside. But Frank refused to acknowledge it. He looked at Goliath, then at Carter. "Heard you've been getting visitors. News travels?" Frank almost smiled. "Small town. Everyone knows everyone's business." He paused. "Also heard you've been skipping meals to buy horse feed." Carter didn't respond to that. It was true, but admitting it felt like admitting weakness. "Maria's been leaving food in your trailer," Frank continued. "Don't insult her by letting it go to waste." Maria Santos was Frank's live-in nurse, a quiet woman in her 40s who spoke little and worked hard. Carter had maybe said 50 words to her in 3 years, but he'd noticed the containers of food appearing on his doorstep. Good food, the kind that required effort and care. He'd been eating it because he was too tired to cook and too hungry to refuse. "I'll thank her." "You'll eat," Frank corrected. "Man can't work on an empty stomach." He studied Carter with those ice-blue eyes. "You're losing weight, working yourself to death." Carter thought about all the reasons. Because he owed it to Kelly. Because he'd failed too many times to afford another failure. Because Goliath deserved someone who wouldn't quit on him. But what he said was simpler. Because it matters. Frank nodded slowly, as if Carter had passed another test. "Good answer." He turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. I'm raising your wage another $100 a month." Before Carter could protest, Frank held up a hand. "It's not charity. It's payment for the work you're doing. This horse is bringing people here. Notice that. Could be valuable if you handle it right." After Frank left, Carter stood alone in the barn and felt the weight of expectations settling onto his shoulders. This had started as a simple rescue, a broken man trying to save a broken horse. But it was becoming something more, something that other people were noticing, something that mattered to more than just him. The responsibility should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like purpose. That night, Carter sat on the steps of his trailer and looked up at the Wyoming stars. Somewhere out there, Kelly was gone. His marriage was ashes. His teaching career was destroyed. Everything he'd built in the first half of his life had crumbled into nothing. But he had this, a dying horse that refused to die, a job that was becoming a calling, people who were starting to trust him with things that mattered. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was progress. And progress, Carter had learned, was all you could ask for when you'd hit bottom and were trying to claw your way back up. He finished his coffee, checked on Goliath one more time, and went to sleep with something approaching peace in his chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tomorrow he'd face them the same way he'd faced everything else since getting sober. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one refusal to quit at a time. In the barn, Goliath dozed in his stall, his powerful chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The wounds that should have killed him were healing. The body that should have given up was getting stronger. And the amber eyes that had first asked Carter if he was there to help or to watch death unfold had found their answer. Someone had finally shown up. Someone was finally fighting. And that, it turned out, made all the difference. The sun would rise in 6 hours, and when it did, Carter would rise with it. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But for the first time in 3 years, the work felt like it was building towards something instead of just filling time until the next disaster. He didn't have $6,000 yet. Didn't have a plan for what came after these 3 months of antibiotics ran out. Didn't have answers to the 100 other problems that were waiting just over the horizon. But he had today. And today, Goliath was alive. Today, a little girl had smiled. Today, Carter Wright had looked at himself in the mirror and not completely hated what he saw. In the mathematics of redemption, that was enough to keep going. The question was whether it would be enough to finish what he'd started. Time would tell. But for tonight, with the stars overhead and the sound of a horse breathing in the barn, and the knowledge that he'd made it through another day sober, Carter allowed himself something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He allowed himself to hope. Winter came to Wyoming the way it always did, sudden and unforgiving. One day the grass was merely brown and dormant. The next it was buried under 6 inches of snow that fell in a single night. Carter woke to a world transformed, white and silent and cold enough to make his joints ache before he even got out of bed. 58 years old and feeling every one of them in the frozen pre-dawn darkness. He dressed in layers and headed to the barn, boots crunching through fresh snow, breath-forming clouds that hung in the still air. 3 months since he'd found Goliath chained to that tree. 3 months of dawn to midnight work, of watching a dying horse refuse to die, of discovering that saving something could save you back. The barn door protested when he opened it, hinges stiff with cold. Inside, the temperature was barely warmer than outside, but at least the wind couldn't reach them here. Goliath stood in his stall, head turned toward the sound of Carter's entrance, eyes bright and alert. The transformation was remarkable. Where once there had been a skeletal creature barely clinging to life, now stood a horse that looked almost healthy. The wounds had healed into thick scars, the ribs no longer showed like xylophone keys, and the coat had developed a shine that caught what little light filtered through the barn windows. "Morning," Carter said quietly. Goliath nickered in response, a sound that still caught Carter off guard. For the first 6 weeks, the horse had been silent except for labored breathing. Now he communicated, asking for food or attention or just acknowledging Carter's presence. It was a small thing, but small things mattered when you were building a life from rubble. Carter was measuring out grain when he heard the truck pull up outside. Too early for Sarah's weekly checkup. Too early for anyone, really, except people who brought trouble. He set down the feed bucket and walked to the barn door, hand automatically going to the knife on his belt. Old habits from construction sites where arguments sometimes turn physical. The truck was a Dodge Ram, newer model, black paint job that screamed money. The man who climbed out was 48, maybe 50, wearing prison-issue clothes that hung loose on a frame that had once been muscular, but was now just lean. Tattoos crawled up his forearms, the kind you got in county lockup when you had nothing but time and poor judgment. He had the look of someone who'd been beaten by life, but wasn't quite broken yet. The man stood by his truck for a long moment, staring at the barn. Then he started walking, slow and deliberate, like a man approaching a grave. Carter stepped out to meet him, blocking the barn entrance. "Can I help you?" The man stopped, about 10 feet away. His eyes were hard, but there was something else underneath. Regret, maybe, or just exhaustion. "That my horse in your barn?" Carter felt ice settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Depends on who's asking." "Wade Holloway, and that's my horse, Goliath." The name from the note, W.H. Wade Holloway, who chained a 1,000-pound animal to a tree and walked away. Carter's hands curled into fists. Horse was abandoned, left to die. That makes him mine by law. Wade's jaw tightened. "I left a note. Said if he lived, he was yours. But I also said debt paid. That horse was collateral on money I borrowed. Debt's still owed, which means the collateral still belongs to my creditor." Carter studied the man, looking for signs of a con. What he saw instead was someone carrying a weight similar to his own. Different details, same crushing guilt. "You chained him there. Left him for 3 weeks. Wade flinched like he'd been slapped. "I know what I did." "Then you know you got no claim to him." "I got legal papers say otherwise." Wade pulled a folded document from his jacket. "Loan agreement, signed and notarized. Goliath's listed as collateral. Debt unpaid means the horse belongs to the man I borrowed from." Carter didn't reach for the papers. "I spent 3 months bringing that horse back from the edge. Spent money I don't have. Time I'll never get back. You don't get to show up now and take him." "I'm not here to take him." Wade's voice was quiet. "I'm here to warn you. Man I owe, he's not like you and me. He doesn't care about right or wrong. He cares about what's his. And legally, that horse is his. Then he can come talk to me himself." "He will." Wade looked past Carter toward the barn. "Can I see him just for a minute?" Every instinct Carter had screamed no. This man had tortured Goliath, left him to die alone in the wilderness. He deserved nothing except maybe a beating. But Carter thought about second chances, about how he'd been given one despite not deserving it. Thought about how judgment was easy when you hadn't walked in someone else's shoes. 1 minute, you upset him, you're done. They walked into the barn together, maintaining careful distance like boxers circling before a fight. When Wade saw Goliath, he stopped dead. The horse had turned toward them, ears forward, watching Wade with those intelligent, golden eyes. Jesus, Wade breathed. You saved him. Did what needed doing. Wade approached the stall slowly, hands visible, moving like a man approaching something holy. Goliath's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The horse's ears went back, his body tensed, and he retreated to the far corner of the stall. Fear or memory, or both. It's okay, boy, Wade said, voice breaking. I'm not gonna hurt you. I swear I'm not gonna hurt you. But Goliath didn't believe him. The horse pressed against the back wall, trembling, eyes showing white. All the progress of 3 months evaporated in seconds. Time's up, Carter said. Wade stood there for another moment, tears running down his face before turning away. At the barn door, he stopped. You want to know why I did it? Not particularly. I owe a man $50,000. Money I borrowed to cover gambling debts. When I couldn't pay, he sent people to explain what happens to folks who don't pay their debts. Wade touched his side where Carter could see the outline of bandages under his shirt. I had two choices. Give him Goliath or give him my life. I chose wrong, but I chose to live. Carter said nothing. I chained him where I knew someone would find him, Wade continued, sent text messages with the coordinates to every rancher within 20 miles. I was hoping someone would save him while I bought time to figure out how to pay my debt. Wade's voice was hollow. Then I got arrested on an outstanding warrant. Spent 18 months in county. By the time I got out, I figured he was dead. He left without another word, climbing into his truck and driving away, leaving Carter alone with more questions than answers. Inside the barn, Goliath was still trembling. Carter spent the next hour calming him down, talking in that low, steady voice, reminding the horse that he was safe now. But the damage was done. The past had shown up, and they both knew it wasn't finished with them yet. 3 days later, a different truck arrived. This one was a Lincoln Navigator, black and spotless, the kind of vehicle that cost more than Carter had earned in the past 5 years combined. The man who emerged was in his 60s, Chinese-American, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Goliath's vet bills. He carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who'd never heard the word no and meant it. 2 younger men climbed out after him, both wearing cheaper suits and expensive watches. Muscle dressed up as business associates. The older man approached Carter, who was repairing fence near the barn, and smiled. A polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Wright, my name is David Chen. I believe we have business to discuss. Carter straightened, feeling his back protest. Don't believe we do. Chen's smile didn't waver. I think you'll find we do. You're in possession of property that belongs to me. A horse named Goliath. Horse belongs to me. Found him abandoned, nursed him back to health. That's how the law works. Chen pulled out a phone, tapped the screen a few times, and held it out. Carter saw legal documents, signatures, dates. Everything looked official. Wade Holloway signed a contract using Goliath as collateral for a $50,000 loan, Chen explained. The loan remains unpaid, therefore the collateral belongs to me. He pocketed the phone. I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Wright. I'm willing to forgive Wade's debt entirely if you simply return my property. Carter thought about the legal system, about how it favored people with money and lawyers. Thought about fighting this in court with no resources and no allies. Thought about losing Goliath after everything they'd been through. No, Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. I'm offering you a clean solution to a complex problem. You're refusing? That horse nearly died because of your debt. I'm not letting him go back into a situation where he's treated like property. Everything is property, Mr. Wright. Your truck, your clothes, your freedom. Chen gestured toward the barn. That animal. The only question is who owns what. And legally, I own the horse. Then you'll have to take him by force. Carter's voice was flat, which I don't recommend. One of Chen's associates stepped forward, but Chen held up a hand. Violence is inefficient. He pulled a business card from his pocket and offered it to Carter. You have 30 days to reconsider. After that, I'll pursue legal remedies. I suggest you hire a lawyer. After they left, Carter stood in the cold morning air, and tried to calculate the odds. He had maybe $2,000 saved. A lawyer would cost 10 times that, minimum. Chen had unlimited resources and legal documentation. This was a fight Carter couldn't win, unless he found a different way to fight. That evening, Frank called Carter to the main house. The old man was sitting in his recliner, thinner than he'd been a month ago, skin taking on that translucent quality that spoke of systems shutting down. Maria hovered nearby, adjusting pillows and checking medications, her face carefully neutral. Since the conversation 3 weeks ago, when Maria had confessed to skimming Frank's pain medications, things had shifted. She'd stopped immediately, had broken down crying when Carter promised to help her daughter another way. Frank had known, of course. The old man missed nothing, but he'd chosen to forgive rather than punish, had even increased Maria's wages to cover her daughter's school expenses legitimately. It was a quiet redemption, the kind that happened in shadows rather than spotlight. Heard you had visitors, Frank said. News travels. Chen's making a play for the horse. Appears so. Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying Carter with those ice blue eyes. You know you can't win this fight. Not legally. Probably not. So what are you going to do? Carter thought about walking away. Thought about how much easier life would be if he just let Chen take Goliath. Washed his hands of the whole situation. Went back to being a simple ranch hand who showed up, did his work, and didn't get attached to anything. Thought about eyes, the color of gold, asking if he was there to help or to watch things die. Gonna fight anyway. Frank nodded slowly, as if Carter had given the only acceptable answer. Good. He gestured to Maria, who handed him a folder. These are the ranch property deeds. Every inch of this land is legally mine, no mortgage, no liens. As of today, it's also legally yours. Carter stared at the folder without taking it. What? You save that horse, you prove you can run this place. It's yours when I die. That was the deal. Frank's voice was firm despite his weakness. I'm just moving up the timeline. Effective immediately, you're the legal owner of the Brennan Ranch. 2,000 acres, all buildings, all equipment. Carter's mind reeled. I haven't proven anything yet. You've proven enough. Frank leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written across his features. You think I don't see what you've been doing? Working yourself to death for an animal most people would have shot on sight. Turning this place into something that matters. He paused. I'm 78 years old and I'll be dead before spring. I can wait and let my daughter inherit. Sell it all to developers within a week. Or I can give it to someone who'll actually fight for it. Your daughter deserves to know. My daughter lives in Seattle and hasn't visited in 3 years. She made her choice. Frank closed his eyes. This is my land, my legacy. I give it to who I want. Carter took the folder with hands that shook slightly. Inside were deeds, transfer documents, everything necessary to make him the legal owner of property worth at least $2 million. More than he'd earned in his entire life. More than he knew what to do with. Why? The question came out barely above a whisper. Frank opened his eyes one more time. Because 3 years ago, a broken-down drunk showed up looking for work, and I saw something in him. Didn't know what exactly. Just knew he reminded me of myself 40 years ago, when I came back from Korea with nightmares and a drinking problem and nothing but a worthless piece of land to my name. He coughed, a wet sound that spoke of fluid in his lungs. You want to know the real reason I'm giving you this ranch? Carter waited. Because you're doing what I should have done, fighting for something that matters instead of just surviving. Frank's voice was getting weaker. I've been testing you since the day you arrived. Every impossible task, every early morning, every time I pushed you to quit. I was looking for someone who wouldn't. He paused, breath labored. The cancer, I've had it 3 years, could have done treatment. Doctor said I might get 5 more years, but I said no. Carter felt something cold settle in his chest. Why would you refuse treatment? Because I was waiting to see if men like you still existed. Men who'd work themselves to death for something that mattered. Men who'd save a dying horse just because it was the right thing to do. Frank's eyes were bright despite the weakness. I needed to know this land would go to someone worthy, so I bet my life on finding that person before the cancer took me. You've been dying on purpose. I've been choosing how I die. There's a difference. Frank managed a weak smile, and I chose right. You're the man I was looking for, Carter. Make it count, son. Make it all count. Maria ushered Carter out shortly after, explaining that Frank needed rest. Carter stood on the porch of the main house, holding a folder that represented everything he'd never expected to have, and tried to process what had just happened. He owned land, real land, with papers and deeds and legal standing, which meant he had something Chen couldn't simply take. It meant he could fight back. It also meant he had something to lose. The legal battle began 2 weeks later, when Carter received a summons to appear in court. Chen was petitioning for immediate return of property, claiming Carter had unlawfully detained a horse that served as collateral for an outstanding debt. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in the county courthouse. Carter had never been inside a courtroom as anything other than a defendant, drunk and disorderly, DUI, public intoxication. He knew what it felt like to stand before a judge and be found wanting. This felt different. This time he was fighting for something instead of just accepting punishment. He couldn't afford a lawyer, so he represented himself. Walked into that courtroom in the only suit he owned, a 20-year-old thing that didn't fit right anymore, and stood before Judge Martha Reynolds. The judge was in her late 60s, with steel gray hair and a face that suggested she'd seen every kind of nonsense the legal system could produce and was unimpressed by all of it. She read through the petition, looked at Chen's lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s, and then looked at Carter. "Mr. Wright, you're representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you understand the claims being made against you?" "I understand a man is trying to take a horse I saved from dying. Claims the horse was collateral for a debt." The judge turned to Chen's lawyer. "Counsel, present your case." The lawyer was efficient, presented the loan documents, showed where Wade Holloway had signed Goliath over as collateral, demonstrated that the debt remained unpaid. Everything was clean, legal, airtight. Carter watched his case evaporate with every piece of evidence. When it was his turn, Carter stood and tried to explain. Told the judge about finding Goliath chained to a tree, about the infected wounds and the starvation. Explained that he'd spent 3 months and thousands of dollars bringing the horse back from death's door. Argued that Wade had abandoned the animal, which under Wyoming law meant Carter had legitimate claim. Chen's lawyer countered that abandonment required intent, and Wade's note clearly stated the horse was collateral, not abandoned. She presented text messages Wade had sent to local ranchers, including Frank Brennan, with GPS coordinates. Evidence of Wade's intent to have the horse found and cared for. Judge Reynolds listened to everything, made notes, and finally looked up. "This is complicated. Both parties have legitimate claims." She paused. "I'm ordering a 60-day evaluation period. Mr. Wright retains custody of the horse, but Mr. Holloway is granted supervised visitation rights twice weekly. In 60 days, we reconvene. At that time, Mr. Holloway can reclaim Goliath if he can demonstrate financial ability to care for the animal properly." The gavel came down, and Carter felt something between relief and dread. He had 60 days. Not a victory, but not a loss. Time to figure out what came next. Outside the courthouse, Chen approached him. His expression was pleasant, almost friendly. "Mr. Wright, I respect tenacity. You're fighting for something you care about." He pulled out another business card. "But fighting costs money. Legal fees, time away from work. I'm offering you a way out. Sell me the horse for $20,000, more than he's worth, and you walk away clean." Carter looked at the card, then at Chen. "Why do you want him so badly? It's not about the money." Chen's smile was thin. "You're right. It's about principle. Wade Holloway borrowed from me and failed to pay. If I let that stand, if I let others think they can default on obligations without consequence, my entire business collapses." He pocketed the card. "The horse is a symbol, nothing more. He's more than that to me. Then you're going to lose everything to keep him." Chen's voice was matter-of-fact. "Because in 60 days, Wade will fail to demonstrate financial capability. The court will award me the horse, and you'll have spent 2 months fighting a battle you cannot win." After Chen left, Carter sat in his truck in the courthouse parking lot and stared at nothing. The man was right. Wade was fresh out of prison, no job, no prospects. There was no way he'd be financially stable enough to care for a horse in 60 days, which meant Carter had 60 days before losing Goliath was inevitable. Unless Wade succeeded. Unless somehow, miraculously, the man who had chained Goliath to a tree got his life together enough to meet the court's requirements. It was a choice between certainties. Lose the horse to Chen, or help Wade become stable enough to reclaim him. Either way, Carter lost Goliath. The only question was whether he lost him to someone who'd treat him as property, or to someone who'd actually care. Not much of a choice, but it was the only one he had. Carter started tracking Wade down that evening, found him at a motel on the edge of town, one of those weekly rate places where people went when they'd run out of better options. Wade answered the door, looking worse than he had at the ranch, unshaven and hollow-eyed. "Need to talk," Carter said. Wade let him in without comment. The room was small and depressing, with stains on the carpet and a smell that suggested the previous occupant had been there too long. Wade sat on the edge of the bed. Carter took the only chair. "Court gave you 60 days to prove you can care for Goliath." "I know." Wade's voice was flat. "I can't. I'm broke, unemployed, and nobody's hiring ex-cons. Chen's going to get the horse. Unless you get stable. Job, income, housing." Wade laughed, a bitter sound. "You offering to help me after what I did?" Carter thought about Kelly, about all the ways he'd failed her. Thought about how someone had given him a chance despite not deserving it. Thought about how sometimes the hardest thing was helping people who'd hurt what you loved. "I'm offering information. Ranch supply store in town is hiring. Owner's a friend of Frank's. Job's yours if you show up sober and willing to work." Wade stared at him. "Why would you do this?" "Because the alternative is worse." Carter stood to leave. "You hurt that horse. Maybe you had reasons. Maybe you didn't. But you get your life together. Maybe you can make it right. You don't. Chen wins. Your choice." He left Wade sitting in that depressing motel room and drove back to the ranch. When he got there, Goliath was waiting in his stall, watching the door. Carter fed him, checked his water, spent an hour just sitting in the straw talking about nothing and everything. Might be helping the man who hurt you get you back. I know that doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense to me either, but it's the least bad option in a situation with no good ones. Goliath listened with those steady eyes, and Carter chose to believe the horse understood. The next morning, Maria found Carter in the barn and told him Frank wanted to see him. Her face was grim, which meant it was bad news. Frank was always sick these days, but there were degrees of sick, and Maria's expression suggested they'd crossed into new territory. Frank was in bed, which was unusual. The old man had spent the last month refusing to acknowledge his declining condition, insisting on sitting in his recliner, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Seeing him flat on his back, skin the color of old parchment, was like watching a mountain erode in real time. "You look like hell," Carter said. Frank managed a weak smile. "Feel worse." He gestured for Carter to sit. "Need to tell you something." Carter sat in the chair beside the bed, noting how small Frank looked now, how the cancer had eaten away at him until there was barely anything left. "You already told me about the cancer, about waiting for someone worthy." Frank shook his head slightly. "Not all of it. There's more you need to know." He paused, gathering strength. "My daughter doesn't want this ranch. Never did. But there's someone who did want it. My granddaughter." Carter hadn't known Frank had a granddaughter, Sophia. She lived with her father, my son-in-law. Frank's voice got quieter. He was hurting her, abusing her. And there was a teacher who saw it, who tried to help, who reported it and got destroyed for his trouble. Carter felt ice forming in his chest. Lost his job, lost his family, lost everything because he tried to save my granddaughter. Frank's eyes were bright with tears. I couldn't help him then. My daughter chose her husband over the truth. Cut me off when I tried to intervene. But I followed that teacher's story. Watched him fall apart. Watched him end up working construction. Then lose that to drinking. No, 3 years ago, a broken man showed up at my ranch looking for work. And I recognized him. Carter Wright, the teacher who tried to save Sophia. Frank reached out, gripped Carter's hand with surprising strength. "You saved her, Carter. The paper trail you started, it eventually led to her father's arrest. She's safe now, in foster care, doing well, because of you." Carter couldn't breathe. All this time, Frank had known, had hired him not out of pity, but out of debt. "This ranch, it's not charity. It's what I owe you for saving my granddaughter's life." Frank's voice was fading. "You were willing to lose everything for a child who wasn't yours. That's the kind of man who deserves land. That's the kind of man who'll use it right." Maria entered quietly, touched Frank's shoulder. "He needs rest now." Carter stood on shaking legs. "I didn't know." "I know. That's what made it real." Frank closed his eyes. "Make it count, son." Carter walked out of that room carrying a weight he'd never expected. Frank's entire relationship with him had been built on a secret Carter hadn't known existed. He'd saved a child without knowing she was Frank's granddaughter, had lost everything for doing the right thing. And Frank had spent 3 years repaying that debt by rebuilding the man who'd saved his family. The revelation changed nothing and everything. The ranch was still his. The fight for Goliath continued. But now Carter understood that his redemption had started long before he found a horse chained to a tree. It had started the day he chose to protect a child, even when it cost him everything. That evening, Wade showed up at the ranch driving a beat-up Ford that sounded like it was held together with hope and duct tape. He climbed out wearing work clothes and approached Carter with something that might have been hope in his eyes. "Got the job. Start Monday." Carter nodded. "Good." They stood there in the cold, two broken men connected by a horse and bad choices and the slim possibility of redemption. "I need you to know," Wade said, "I loved that horse. When I chained him up, I thought I was buying time. Thought I'd come back for him." Wade's voice cracked. "I made the worst choice of my life, and he paid for it. If I get him back, I swear I'll spend the rest of my life making it right. You get him back, you keep that promise. Otherwise, you'll answer to me." "Fair enough." After Wade left, Carter went to check on Goliath. The horse was restless tonight, pacing his stall, sensing something in the air. Carter let himself into the stall and stood beside the great black horse, one hand on his neck. "Things are about to get complicated. Court says if Wade gets stable, he can take you back. Part of me wants to fight that, wants to keep you here where I know you're safe. But the other part knows that sometimes doing right means letting go." Goliath turned his head, meeting Carter's gaze. "I'm going to help him. The man who hurt you. I'm going to help him become someone who deserves you. And then I'm going to have to watch you leave." Carter's voice was rough. "Because that's what you do when you love something. You put their needs ahead of yours." The horse leaned into Carter's touch, and they stood like that for a long time, man and horse, both of them scarred by their pasts, both of them learning to trust again. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the ranch in fresh white, erasing tracks, burying the old world under the new. In the main house, Frank Brennan lay dying, his life's work transferred to a man he'd chosen to carry it forward. In town, Chen was probably planning his next legal move, confident that money and lawyers would prevail over sentiment and stubbornness. And in the barn, Carter stood with a horse that shouldn't have survived, plotting how to give him back to the man who'd nearly killed him, because sometimes the right choice was the hardest one. The war wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But Carter had learned something in his 2 years of sobriety, something that applied to horses and ranches and broken men trying to rebuild their lives. You don't win wars in a day. You win them one battle at a time, one choice at a time, one refusal to surrender at a time. And as long as you were still standing, still fighting, still choosing to do right even when wrong was easier, you hadn't lost yet. Carter left the barn as full dark settled over the ranch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Wade might fail. Chen might find a way to take Goliath regardless. Frank might die before seeing how this all turned out. But tonight, Goliath was safe. Tonight, Carter was sober. Tonight, the ranch was his to protect. And tonight, that was enough to keep fighting. Frank Brennan died on a Tuesday morning in late January, 3 days after the first real blizzard of the season had buried the ranch under 2 feet of snow. Carter found him in his bed, peaceful, one hand resting on a photograph of his wife who'd been gone for 20 years. Maria was sitting beside him, tears running silently down her face, holding Frank's other hand like she could anchor him to this world through sheer will. "He went in his sleep," she said quietly. No pain at the end, just closed his eyes and didn't open them again. Carter stood in the doorway of Frank's bedroom, feeling the weight of what had just shifted onto his shoulders. The ranch was his now. Not as a promise or a potential, but as reality. 2,000 acres of Wyoming land and everything that came with it. Responsibility for Maria's job. Responsibility for keeping the legacy alive. Responsibility for proving Frank's faith hadn't been misplaced. "He's at peace," Maria continued. "Last thing he said yesterday was that he could rest now, that he'd found what he was looking for." She paused, wiping her eyes. "And he told me to tell you something. He said thank you for trusting me, even after you knew about the medications." Carter remembered that conversation weeks ago when Maria had confessed to skimming Frank's pain meds to sell for her daughter's education. How she'd broken down when Carter had promised to help her find another way. How Frank had known all along but had chosen forgiveness over punishment. Had quietly raised Maria's wages to cover the school expenses legitimately. Small acts of grace from a hard man who understood that people needed second chances. He forgave you, Carter said. That meant something to him. It meant everything to me, Maria whispered. Carter nodded, not trusting his voice. He'd known this was coming, had watched Frank deteriorate day by day over the past month. But knowing and experiencing were different things. Frank had been more than an employer. He'd been the first person in 3 years to look at Carter and see potential instead of failure. I'll handle the arrangements, Carter said finally. He already did. Maria gestured to a folder on the nightstand. Everything's planned. Where he wants to be buried, what he wants on the headstone, who to call. Even wrote his own obituary, said he didn't trust anyone else to get it right. That sounded like Frank, a man who controlled everything he could control and accepted what he couldn't. The funeral was scheduled for Friday, which gave Carter 3 days to dig a grave in frozen ground. He refused offers of help from the funeral home, refused the mechanized digger they suggested. This was something that needed to be done by hand, the old way, with shovel and sweat and time to think about what was being buried. He worked in the bitter cold, breaking through frost-hardened earth one shovelful at a time. His back screamed, his hands blistered and bled. The knee that was always bad became something approaching catastrophic. But he didn't stop. This was the last thing he could do for Frank, and he'd do it right. Wade showed up on the second day, drove out to the ranch in his beat-up Ford, and climbed out wearing work gloves and carrying a second shovel. Heard about Frank. Thought you might need help. Carter looked at him, at this man who'd hurt Goliath, who was maybe trying to become someone better. Thought about pride and practicality, and how sometimes accepting help was harder than refusing it. Ground's frozen 2 feet down. Going to take both of us to finish before Friday. They worked in silence, taking turns with the digging, neither one complaining about the cold or the difficulty. By sunset, they'd made real progress, and by Thursday evening, the grave was complete. 6 feet deep, wall straight, bottom level, a place worthy of the man who'd rest there. Thanks, Carter said as they were packing up the tools. Wade leaned on his shovel, breath-forming clouds in the freezing air. Frank gave me a chance once, 10 years ago, before the gambling got bad, hired me for seasonal work, treated me fair. I repaid him by stealing equipment to sell for poker money. He paused. Never forgot that. Man gave me a chance and I threw it away. Helping dig his grave is the least I owe him. After Wade left, Carter stood at the edge of the empty grave and thought about debts, about how some could be repaid and others couldn't, about how trying mattered even when success wasn't guaranteed. The funeral service was small. Maybe 30 people showed up, which was about right for a man who'd spent his life working alone and dying slowly. Sarah Garrett gave the eulogy, speaking about Frank's service in Korea, his 40 years ranching in Wyoming, his stubborn refusal to quit even when his body was giving out. She didn't mention the cancer or the treatment he'd refused, just talked about a man who'd lived on his own terms and died the same way. They buried Frank on the hill overlooking the ranch, the spot he'd picked out himself. Carter and Wade and 4 other men lowered the casket into the frozen ground, while Maria wept quietly and Sarah read from a Bible that looked like it had survived its own war. When it was done, when the last shovelful of earth had been placed and the temporary marker set, people filed past to pay respects. Carter stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, looking down at the fresh-turned soil. I'll take care of it, he said to the ground. The ranch, the legacy, all of it. I'll make it count. The wind was his only answer, cold and relentless, carrying away words the way it carried away everything else that wasn't tied down. He walked back to the ranch house as the sun was setting, feeling older than his 58 years. Maria was in the kitchen, packing her belongings into cardboard boxes. Carter stopped in the doorway. You leaving? Maria didn't look up from her packing. Mr. Frank was my employer. Now he's gone. Time for me to go too. Ranch needs a cook. Job's yours if you want it. She paused, hand still on a framed photograph of her daughter back in Mexico. I am illegal, Mr. Wright. You know this. I cannot work legally. Don't care about legal. Care about keeping this place running. Carter leaned against the doorframe. Frank trusted you, even after everything. That's good enough for me. Maria turned to face him, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the fear of someone who'd been running for too long. Immigration, they can come anytime. Take me away. You want that trouble? I want someone who knows how this place works, someone Frank trusted, someone who's proven they can change. Carter straightened. You stopped taking the medications when I asked. You've been honest since. That counts for something. You stay as long as you want. Anything happens, we'll deal with it. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I stay. For now. And Mr. Wright, thank you for giving me a second chance. We all need those. It was the most either of them could promise in a world where nothing was certain. The 60 days the judge had given them were ticking down. Wade had the job at the ranch supply store, was showing up on time and working hard according to the owner, had moved out of the weekly motel and into a shared apartment with two other guys trying to rebuild their lives, was attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 times a week, getting his feet under him one day at a time. Carter found himself in an impossible position. The better Wade did, the closer they came to the day when the judge would rule in his favor and Goliath would leave. Carter had worked for 4 months to save that horse, had poured money and time and pieces of his soul into the effort, and now he was actively helping ensure his own loss. But the alternative was Chen. Cold, calculating Chen, who saw Goliath as nothing more than a ledger entry, a symbol to prove that debts got collected and promises got kept. If Wade failed, Chen won, and that was unacceptable. So Carter kept helping, kept encouraging, kept checking in on Wade's progress and offering advice on staying clean. Kept digging his own grave the same way he dug Frank's, one shovelful at a time, knowing exactly what he was doing and why. The crisis came on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after Frank's funeral, when Carter returned from town to find immigration and customs enforcement vehicles parked outside the ranch house. 3 agents in tactical gear, 2 marked cars, all of it official and terrifying and designed to make people comply through overwhelming presence. Maria was standing on the porch, hands cuffed behind her back, face blank with the kind of resignation that came from always knowing this day would arrive. One of the agents was talking at her, reading rights or explaining process. Carter couldn't tell which. He parked his truck and climbed out, moving carefully, aware that sudden movements around armed federal agents was a good way to get shot. The agent in charge, a man in his 40s with the build of someone who spent time in the gym, turned to face him. You the property owner? I am. We have a warrant for Maria Elena Santos. Deportation order. She's been living and working in the country illegally for 15 years. Carter looked at Maria, saw the apology in her eyes. She'd known this would happen, had warned him, and he'd told her to stay anyway. This was on him. She works for me. She's paid taxes every year, never been in trouble with the law. She's been clean and honest for months. The agent's expression didn't change. Doesn't matter, she's here illegally. That's the only relevant fact. I need time to get her a lawyer. She can call one from detention. The agent gestured to his colleagues, who began leading Maria toward one of the vehicles. We'll be transporting her to the processing center in Cheyenne. She'll have a hearing in 30 days. Carter stood there, watching them put Maria in the back of a government car, and felt rage building in his chest. Not the hot, explosive kind that led to bar fights and broken knuckles. The cold, calculating kind that came from watching injustice happen and being powerless to stop it. Who reported her? The agent paused before climbing into his vehicle. Anonymous tip. That's all I can tell you. Carter knew who'd made the call before the words were out. Chen, escalating the pressure, taking away Carter's support system, demonstrating that he could reach into Carter's life and break things whenever he chose. After the vehicles left, Carter stood alone in the yard and tried to calculate his next move. Maria would need a lawyer, which meant money he didn't have. She'd need someone fighting her case, advocating for her, and Carter had no idea how to navigate immigration law. He was a construction worker turned ranch hand, not a legal expert. He pulled out his phone and called the only person he knew who might have answers. Sarah answered on the second ring. Carter, what's wrong? ICE just took Maria. Need a lawyer, immigration specialist, someone who can help. Sarah was quiet for a moment. That's expensive. We're talking thousands of dollars. How many thousands? 5 minimum. Could be 10 depending on complexity. You have that kind of money? Carter thought about his bank account, about the $2,000 he'd managed to save, thought about the ranch expenses and Goliath's ongoing care and everything else that required money he didn't have. No. I know someone, Sarah's voice was gentle, works immigration cases pro bono sometimes. Let me make some calls. She hung up, and Carter was left standing in the cold Wyoming afternoon, wondering how many more things Chen was going to take before this was over. The answer came 2 days later when Carter received a notice in the mail. Property tax assessment on the ranch. $47,000 due in 30 days, or the county would move to foreclose. The number didn't make sense. Carter had reviewed Frank's financial records when he took over the ranch. Property taxes were paid current through the end of the year. There shouldn't be any outstanding balance, let alone one approaching $50,000. He drove into town and spent 3 hours at the county assessor's office, going through records and trying to understand what had happened. The clerk, a woman in her 50s who'd worked there longer than Carter had been alive, pulled up the file and frowned. This is strange. Property was current as of December. Then someone applied for a tax lien transfer. What does that mean? It means they bought your outstanding tax debt from the county. Now, instead of owing the county, you owe them, and they can foreclose if you don't pay. She squinted at the screen. Buyer was a shell corporation, DLC Holdings. David Chen, using his initials, not even trying to hide it. Carter drove back to the ranch, feeling like a man watching walls close in from all sides. Maria detained and facing deportation. $47,000 in tax debt he didn't owe but would have to pay anyway. 60 days on the court order, ticking down to the moment when Goliath would leave, regardless of what Carter wanted. Chen had found his pressure points and was squeezing. That night, Carter sat in the barn with Goliath and tried to figure out what came next. The horse had recovered completely now, was strong and healthy and showing no signs of the trauma that had nearly killed him. He'd become something more than just an animal Carter had saved. He'd become a symbol of second chances, of refusing to quit, of the possibility that broken things could heal if given time and care. And now Carter was going to lose him. Not because he'd failed, but because success looked like letting go. You know what the worst part is? Carter spoke quietly, one hand on Goliath's neck. I'm going to have to choose. Pay the tax debt and keep the ranch, or fight for you and lose everything Frank left me. He leaned his forehead against the horse's shoulder. Smart play is obvious. Ranch is worth millions. You're just a horse. Any rational person would make that choice. Goliath turned his head, those steady golden eyes calm and knowing. But you're not just a horse. You're the reason I'm still sober, the reason I get up in the morning, the reason I believe broken things can heal. Carter's voice cracked. How do I put a price on that? The horse had no answer, which was probably just as well. Some questions didn't have good answers. Wade found Carter in the barn around midnight, sitting in the straw, whiskey bottle in hand. Not opened, just held. A reminder of what waited when you stopped fighting. Heard about the tax thing, Wade said from the doorway. That's Chen's play. Force you to choose between the money and the fight. Carter didn't look up. Smart play, effective. Wade walked into the barn, boots quiet on the worn floor. There's another option. Carter finally looked at him. What option? I give myself to him. Wade's voice was steady. I owe him $50,000. He's using Goliath as leverage because that's all I had left. But if I offer myself, work off the debt in his organization, maybe he lets the horse go. You do that, you'll never get clean. Carter set down the bottle. Chen owns people. You go work for him, you become his property. No different than Goliath chained to that tree. Wade sat down on a hay bale looking older than his 48 years. Maybe, but maybe that's the price for what I did. I hurt that horse, hurt you, hurt myself. Maybe working for Chen is what I deserve. Deserving's got nothing to do with it. Carter stood up, joints protesting. You want to make things right? Stay clean, keep working, become someone who can actually care for Goliath when the court gives him back to you. That's how you pay your debt. And if Chen takes the ranch, takes everything you built, then I start over. Carter looked at Goliath, at the horse that had survived chains and starvation and infection. Been there before. Can do it again if I have to. Wade stood, studied Carter for a long moment. You're a stubborn bastard. Takes one to know one. After Wade left, Carter picked up the whiskey bottle one more time. 2 years, 5 months sober. The longest stretch since he'd started drinking at 17. Some nights, like tonight, the thirst was overwhelming. The promise of numbness, of not having to feel the weight of impossible choices and inevitable losses. He unscrewed the cap, smelled the familiar burn that represented everything he'd given up and everything he'd run from. Thought about Kelly's voice on that voicemail he'd finally listened to 6 months ago. Thought about her saying she forgave him, that it wasn't his fault, that she loved him. She'd lied about the fault part. It was his fault. But maybe forgiveness wasn't about deserving it. Maybe it was about accepting it and trying to live in a way that honored it. Carter poured the whiskey onto the barn floor and watched it soak into the wood. Waste of good liquor. But some prices were worth paying. The solution came from an unexpected direction. Sarah called 3 days before the tax payment was due, her voice carrying something that might have been excitement. I found something in Frank's estate papers. Carter was fixing fence on the north pasture, phone wedged between his shoulder and ear. What kind of something? A life insurance policy. Paid out on death, beneficiary is the ranch itself. Sarah paused. It's for $50,000. Carter stopped working. Frank had life insurance? Apparently. Never mentioned it, but the paperwork's all here. Company confirmed the payout. Check should arrive in 3 business days. She paused. You can pay the tax debt. The relief should have been overwhelming. Instead, Carter felt something more complicated. Frank had planned for this, had known Chen or someone like him would come after the ranch eventually, had made sure Carter would have the resources to fight back. Even in death, the old man was still testing him, still teaching him, still proving that planning ahead mattered more than luck. Thank you, Sarah. There's more. The immigration lawyer I connected you with, she thinks Maria has a good case. 15 years of tax payments, no criminal record, essential worker status. The fact that she self-corrected when confronted about the medication issue shows character growth. She's filing for humanitarian parole. Maria might be able to stay. Might? Immigration law is complicated, but it's a better chance than she had before. Sarah's voice softened. You're holding this together, Carter. The ranch, Maria's case, Goliath's situation. Frank would be proud. After hanging up, Carter stood in the middle of 2,000 acres of land he now owned and felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders. Not crushing exactly, just heavy. The kind of weight that came with responsibility and legacy and other people depending on you not to fail. He could save the ranch, could probably help Maria, could keep everything running until the court date that would determine Goliath's fate. But he couldn't save everything, couldn't keep the horse and honor the court's decision, couldn't have it all just because he'd worked hard and made sacrifices and refused to quit. Some losses were inevitable. The only question was whether you faced them with dignity or fell apart. Carter chose dignity, chose to keep working, keep fighting, keep showing up even when the outcome was predetermined. Because that's what men like Frank had taught him. You don't quit just because victory's impossible. You quit when you're dead, and sometimes not even then. The court date arrived on a cold March morning with the last remnants of winter still clinging to the mountains. Carter wore his funeral suit, the same one he'd worn for Frank's service, and drove into town with Wade sitting silent in the passenger seat. Wade had done everything right, had 6 weeks of steady employment, had moved into his own apartment, had bank statements showing regular deposits and responsible spending, had attendance records from Gamblers Anonymous meetings, and a sponsor who would testify to his commitment to recovery. He'd become, against all odds, someone who could care for a horse. The courtroom was the same one they'd been in 2 months ago. Judge Reynolds presiding, Chen's lawyer present, but Chen himself absent, probably confident that the outcome was predetermined. Wade's court-appointed attorney was young, fresh out of law school, but thorough. She'd prepared her case well. The proceeding was brief. Wade's lawyer presented evidence of employment, housing, and recovery program participation. Showed that Wade had met every requirement the court had set. Chen's lawyer argued that the debt remained unpaid, therefore the collateral remained Chen's property. But Judge Reynolds cut her off. Mr. Holloway has demonstrated financial stability and ability to care for the animal in question. The court finds that he has met the conditions set forth in the previous ruling. She looked at Wade over her reading glasses. Mr. Holloway, the court is awarding you custody of Goliath, effective immediately. However, you should know that there is a substantial debt attached to this animal. $50,000. That debt doesn't disappear simply because custody transfers. Wade stood up. Your Honor, I'll pay it. However long it takes, I'll pay what I owe. See that you do. The gavel came down, court adjourned. Outside the courthouse, Wade and Carter stood in the parking lot. Neither one seemed to know what to say. I'll come get him this weekend, Wade said finally. Give you time to say goodbye. Carter nodded, not trusting his voice. And Carter? Wade's voice was rough. Thank you for helping me when you had no reason to, for seeing something worth saving. We're both just broken men trying to do better. Yeah, Wade almost smiled. Guess we are. He drove away, and Carter stood alone in the parking lot watching the traffic pass. It was done. In 3 days, Goliath would leave. The horse that shouldn't have survived would go back to the man who'd nearly killed him. And Carter would have to live with it. That night, Carter sat in the barn with Goliath for the last time as owner and horse. He didn't talk much, just sat there in the straw, one hand on Goliath's shoulder, listening to the steady breathing that he'd fought so hard to preserve. "You're going to be okay," he said finally. "Wade's different now. Better. He'll take care of you. And if he doesn't, I'll know. I'll come for you." Goliath turned his head, meeting Carter's gaze with those calm, knowing eyes. The same eyes that had asked if Carter was there to help or to watch him die. The same eyes that had seen Carter at his worst and somehow trusted him anyway. "You saved me." "You know," Carter's voice was barely a whisper. "When I found you chained to that tree, I was looking for a reason to stay sober. A reason to believe broken things could heal. You gave me that. You gave me everything." The horse leaned into his touch, and they sat like that until the sun came up. Man and horse, both of them scarred by their pasts. Both of them proof that survival was possible if you refused to quit. Saturday morning arrived too soon. Wade showed up with a horse trailer, proper equipment, all the things he'd need to transport Goliath safely. Carter had prepared the horse, brushed his coat until it shone, checked his hooves, made sure everything was perfect for the journey. Rachel Martinez and her daughter Mia were there, had driven 3 hours to say goodbye to the horse that had helped Mia find her voice again. The girl was crying, but she went up to Goliath and whispered something private, something just between her and the horse. When she stepped back, she looked at Carter with eyes that were sad but strong. "He saved me, just like he saved you." "Yeah, he did." Loading Goliath into the trailer should have been difficult. The horse had never been in a trailer, had no reason to trust enclosed spaces after his time chained in the forest. But he walked in calmly, as if he understood this was necessary, as if he trusted the process even when it was frightening. Carter closed the trailer gate, secured the latch, and stepped back. Wade was in the truck cab, giving him a moment. "You take care of him," Carter called. Wade leaned out the window. "I will. I swear it," he paused. "You need anything, you call me. We're in this together now." The truck pulled away, trailer rattling slightly on the rough ranch road. Carter stood watching until it disappeared over the hill, taking with it 4 months of work and hope and healing. Maria appeared beside him, had walked down from the main house without him noticing. She didn't say anything, just stood there in solidarity. Two people who'd both lost things they loved to forces they couldn't control. "He is gone," she said finally. "Yeah, you did right thing. Doesn't feel right." Maria looked at him with eyes that had seen their own share of loss. "Right things rarely do, Mr. Wright. That is how you know they are right." She walked back to the house, leaving Carter alone with 2,000 acres of land and a barn that suddenly felt too empty. He stood there for a long time, looking at the mountains, at the ranch that was his responsibility now, at the future that stretched out uncertain and difficult and his to shape. Frank had told him to make it count, to turn the ranch into something that mattered. Carter had thought that meant saving Goliath, keeping the horse here, building something around that singular relationship. But maybe it meant something else. Maybe it meant learning that love sometimes looked like letting go, that doing right sometimes meant losing what you valued most. That character was built not in the victories but in how you handled the defeats. Carter walked back to the barn and started cleaning Goliath's stall. The work was automatic, mindless, the kind of thing he'd done 1,000 times before. But it felt different now. Final. He was erasing the evidence that Goliath had ever been here, making room for whatever came next. When the stall was clean, Carter sat down on the overturned bucket where he'd spent so many nights watching Goliath breathe. The barn felt different now, emptier, missing something essential. But the sun would rise tomorrow. The ranch would need work. Maria would need help with her immigration case. The land that Frank had trusted him with would need tending. Life would continue whether Carter was ready for it or not. He pulled out his AA chip, 2 years and 7 months now, and turned it over in his fingers. The bronze was worn smooth from handling, from all the times he'd needed its weight to remind him what he was fighting for. "I'm still here," he said to the empty barn. "Still sober, still fighting, still proving that broken men can build something worth keeping." The barn didn't answer, but Carter hadn't expected it to. Some conversations were meant to be one-sided. Some truths you had to speak into the void and trust that they mattered anyway. He stood up, pocketed the chip, and walked out into the late afternoon sun. There was fence that needed mending on the east pasture. There was always fence that needed mending. And tomorrow there would be more work, more choices, more opportunities to prove that Frank's faith hadn't been misplaced. Carter Wright had lost his daughter to suicide, had lost his marriage to alcohol, had lost his career to circumstance and poor judgment. And now he'd lost Goliath to the complicated mathematics of doing what was right instead of what was easy. But he still had the ranch, still had his sobriety, still had the knowledge that he'd saved a life that mattered, even if he couldn't keep it. And sometimes, in a world where nothing was certain and loss was inevitable, that was enough to keep a man moving forward. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one refusal to quit at a time. The sun set over the Wyoming mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of orange and red. Carter worked until dark, then worked some more, because idle hands led to idle thoughts, and idle thoughts led to the whiskey bottle. He was 59 years old, owner of a ranch he'd never expected to have, guardian of a legacy he was still learning to understand. The road ahead was uncertain. The challenges were real. The losses were permanent. But he was still standing, still breathing, still fighting. And as long as that remained true, there was hope. Even in the darkest hour, even in the moment of greatest loss, there was always hope. Carter held on to that truth like a drowning man holds on to driftwood and let it carry him through to whatever came next. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, as if winter was reluctant to release its grip on the land. Carter Wright watched the snow retreat inch by inch up the mountainsides, revealing brown grass that would eventually turn green if given enough time and rain. He was 3 months past giving Goliath back to Wade, 3 months into learning what the ranch felt like without the horse that had given him a reason to save it in the first place. The work continued. It always did. Fence lines didn't care about loss. Cattle didn't care about grief. The land demanded attention whether you were ready to give it or not. Carter found a strange comfort in that relentless need. Work kept you moving forward, even when standing still felt easier. Maria had won her immigration case, or at least one temporary reprieve. The lawyer Sarah had found, a fierce woman in her 30s who took cases the way other people took crusades, had argued that 15 years of tax payments and zero criminal history meant something. The judge had granted humanitarian parole, giving Maria legal status for 3 years while she pursued permanent residency. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was more than she'd had before. She stayed on at the ranch, running the main house with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown with Frank. Cooked meals that appeared on Carter's doorstep, whether he asked for them or not. Maintained the property like it was her own. Never mentioned the fear she must have felt every day, knowing that legal status could be revoked as easily as it had been granted. Carter was fixing a section of fence on the eastern pasture when he saw the truck approaching. He recognized the vehicle before he could make out the driver. Wade's beat-up Ford, somehow still running despite sounding like it was held together with hope and duct tape. Wade parked and climbed out, and Carter felt his stomach tighten. 3 months without word. 3 months of wondering if he'd made the right choice, if Goliath was being cared for properly, if trusting Wade had been wisdom or just another mistake in a long line of them. "Got something to show you," Wade called. Carter set down his tools and walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool spring air. Wade looked different, healthier. The hollowness that prison and addiction had carved into his face was filling in. He stood straighter, moved with more confidence. "How is he? Come see for yourself." Wade walked to the trailer hitched behind his truck and opened the gate. Goliath backed out carefully, hooves finding purchase on the ramp, moving with the controlled power of an animal in peak condition. The horse's coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, black as midnight and just as deep. His eyes were bright, alert, scanning the familiar landscape of the ranch he'd left 3 months ago. Carter felt something catch in his chest. The horse looked magnificent. More than that, he looked content. There was no fear in his posture, no hesitation, just calm awareness. "He's doing good," Wade said quietly. "Eating well, responding to training. I've been working with him every day." He paused. "Wanted you to see that I'm keeping my promise." Goliath's head turned at the sound of Carter's voice, ears pricking forward. Recognition flashed in those amber eyes. The horse took 2 steps toward Carter, then stopped, as if uncertain whether the approach would be welcome. Carter walked forward and placed his hand on Goliath's neck. The horse leaned into the touch, And for a moment, the 3 months of separation collapsed into nothing. This was the animal he'd freed from chains, nursed back from the edge of death, learned to trust when trust felt impossible. "You've done good work," Carter said. "Had a good teacher." Wade looked at the ground, then back up. "I've been thinking about what comes next." Carter waited. "I'm paying off Chen, 50 a month every month." He gestured toward Goliath. "But this horse, what he can do, the way he helps people, that's bigger than just me owning him." Wade's voice was steady. "I want to bring him back here, not to give him up, but to build something, a program, like you were starting to do before the court case." Carter studied Wade, looking for signs of angle or manipulation. Saw only sincerity and something that might have been hope. "What kind of program?" "Therapy. Equine-assisted therapy for people dealing with addiction, trauma, whatever's breaking them." Wade gestured around the ranch. "You've got the land, I've got the horse, and the experience of being broken. Sarah says she'd help with the medical side. Between all of us, we could make something that matters." Carter thought about Rachel Martinez and her daughter Mia, about how Goliath had given a frightened child her voice back. Thought about all the broken people in the world who needed something to hold on to, something to prove that healing was possible. "You'd run it?" "We'd run it. Together." Wade met his eyes. "I can't do this alone, Carter, and neither can you. But together, maybe we build something that outlasts both of us." It was the kind of idea that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Carter and Wade working together, using Goliath to help others the way the horse had helped them, turning personal redemption into something larger. "Let me think about it." "Fair enough." Wade loaded Goliath back into the trailer. "No pressure, just wanted you to know the offer's there." After Wade left, Carter stood in the pasture and looked at the ranch that was his responsibility now. 2,000 acres of Wyoming land that Frank had entrusted to him with the instruction to make it count, to turn it into something that mattered instead of just another piece of property changing hands. A therapy program would mean construction, permits, insurance, money he didn't have, and expertise he'd need to acquire. It would mean opening the ranch to strangers, letting people into the space he'd been using to hide from the world. It would mean risk. Failure was possible, maybe even likely. He could pour time and resources into something that collapsed within a year, leaving him worse off than he'd started. But doing nothing was also a choice, and doing nothing meant the ranch would just be land, and Carter would just be a man who'd saved one horse and called it redemption. He made his decision before he fully realized he was making it. Called Sarah that evening and asked about the logistics of starting a therapeutic riding program. Called the county planning office and asked about zoning for nonprofit operations on agricultural land. Called Wade back and told him they had a deal. The work began immediately. Sarah connected them with organizations that ran similar programs, people who'd spent years figuring out what worked and what didn't. Carter learned about liability insurance and certification requirements and the 1,000 small details that separated amateur good intentions from professional operations. Wade proved to be more than just an ex-con trying to rebuild his life. He had ideas, good ones, about program structure and client progression. Had been researching equine therapy for months, reading everything he could find, preparing for a possibility he hadn't been sure would materialize. Together, they sketched out a vision. Start small, maybe 10 clients a month. Focus on people dealing with addiction and trauma, populations they both understood from the inside. Charge what people could afford, find grants and donations to cover the rest. Build slowly, carefully, making sure the foundation was solid before trying to expand. Maria volunteered to handle administration, said she'd been managing Frank's paperwork for years and knew how to keep records that would satisfy any auditor. Sarah agreed to serve as medical advisor, providing oversight and connecting them with mental health professionals who could work alongside the equine therapy. 6 weeks after Wade's visit, they held their first planning meeting in Frank's old dining room. The four of them around a table covered in papers and coffee cups, laying out timelines and responsibilities and everything that needed to happen before they could serve their first client. "We need a name," Sarah said, "something that explains what we're doing." Wade suggested Goliath's Hope, but Carter shook his head. "It's not about one horse. It's about what that horse represents." They debated for an hour, throwing out ideas and rejecting them until Maria spoke up quietly. "In my language, we say segunda oportunidad, second chance." She looked around the table. "That is what this place is, no? Second chances for people who think they have none left." The name stuck. Second Chance Ranch, simple, direct, honest about what they were offering. Construction started in late April. Carter did most of the work himself, with Wade helping in the evenings and on weekends. They built accessible ramps and mounting platforms, reinforced the barn to meet code requirements for public access, created a covered arena where therapy sessions could happen regardless of weather. The money came from multiple sources. Carter took out a modest loan against the ranch, enough to cover materials without overextending. Sarah organized a fundraiser through her church, bringing in donations from people who'd known Frank or who believed in what they were trying to build. Wade contributed his savings, every dollar he'd managed to put away during his months of steady employment. It wasn't enough, not nearly, but it was a start, and Carter had learned that sometimes starting was the hardest part. They received their nonprofit status in June and their therapy program certification in July. The bureaucracy was exhausting, endless forms and inspections and requirements. But Carter pushed through it the same way he'd pushed through everything else, one step at a time, one refusal to quit at a time. Their first client arrived on a Tuesday morning in early August. His name was Marcus, 17 years old, court-ordered to attend therapy after his third arrest for drug possession. He showed up angry, defensive, radiating the kind of hostile energy that came from expecting the world to hurt him and being proven right too many times. Carter recognized that anger, had worn it himself for years, used it as armor against caring about anything enough to be disappointed. Marcus stood by the fence, arms crossed, glaring at Goliath like the horse had personally wronged him. "This is bullshit. How's a horse supposed to help me?" Wade approached slowly, hands visible, the way you approach any wounded thing. "Horse isn't going to help you. You're going to help yourself. The horse is just going to show you how." Marcus scoffed but didn't leave. Carter opened the gate and brought Goliath into the arena. The horse moved calmly, aware of the angry teenager but not threatened by him. "You're going to groom him," Wade said. "Brush his coat, clean his hooves. That's it." "That's therapy?" "That's where we start." Marcus took the brush with obvious reluctance, approaching Goliath like the horse might explode at any moment. But Goliath just stood there, patient and still, and eventually the teenager started brushing. Awkward at first, too rough, but Goliath tolerated it. Carter watched from outside the arena as something shifted in Marcus's posture. The anger didn't disappear, but it softened slightly. The boy's movements became gentler, more careful. He was focused on the task, on doing it right, on this one thing he could control in a life that probably felt out of control. After 30 minutes, Wade called time. Marcus set down the brush and looked at Goliath with something that might have been respect. "Same time next week," Wade said. Marcus shrugged, trying to maintain his don't-care facade. Whatever. But he showed up the next week, and the week after that. By the fourth session, he was talking to Goliath while he worked, telling the horse things he probably couldn't tell the humans in his life. Carter heard fragments, stuff about his mom's boyfriend, about school being pointless, about feeling like the world had already decided what he was worth, and there was no point fighting it. Goliath listened with those intelligent amber eyes and didn't judge, didn't offer solutions or platitudes, just accepted whatever Marcus needed to say and kept breathing, kept being present, kept proving that steadiness was possible, even when everything else felt chaotic. By September, they were serving 8 clients a week. Marcus was still coming, was showing up on time now, had stopped getting arrested. A middle-aged woman dealing with PTSD from domestic violence. A veteran who'd come home from Afghanistan with nightmares and a drinking problem he couldn't shake. A 12-year-old girl who'd watched her father die and hadn't spoken since. Each person brought their own wounds, their own specific configuration of broken pieces, and Goliath, in his patient way, helped them start putting those pieces back together. Not through magic, not through some mystical connection between human and horse, just through the simple act of showing up, being consistent, offering a space where vulnerability wasn't punished and progress didn't have to be linear. Carter watched it happen session after session and felt something settling in his chest. Purpose, maybe, or just the satisfaction of knowing that his 4 months of brutal work saving Goliath had resulted in this, in broken people finding their way back to hope. The ranch started to change. Word spread through counselors and social workers and the informal networks that connected hurting people. By October, they had a waiting list. By November, they'd added 3 more horses, rescues that Wade found through contacts in the equine community. None of them had Goliath's particular gift for sensing what people needed, but they were gentle and patient, and that was enough. Sarah recruited volunteers, people willing to donate time to maintain the facility, help with sessions, handle the endless administrative tasks. Maria organized them with quiet efficiency, creating schedules and systems that kept everything running smoothly. And Carter found himself becoming something he'd never expected: a director, a leader, someone other people looked to for decisions and guidance. It felt strange, uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, but he grew into it the same way he'd grown into sobriety, one day at a time. On a cold December morning, almost exactly a year after Frank's death, Carter stood on the hill where they'd buried the old man and looked down at the ranch transformed. The barn was lit up, sessions already underway despite the early hour. Smoke rose from the main house chimney. Vehicles were parked in the newly expanded lot, belonging to clients and volunteers and staff. "Made it count," he said to the ground, "like you told me to." The wind carried his words away, but Carter liked to think Frank heard them anyway. Liked to think the old man was satisfied with what his ranch had become. Not just land being preserved, but land being used for something that mattered. That evening, they held their one-year anniversary celebration. Nothing fancy, just the core team and a few clients who'd become something like family. Wade brought a cake from the grocery store. Sarah said a prayer. Maria served coffee and homemade tamales. Marcus was there, looking different than he had 8 months ago. Cleaner, more present. He'd gotten his GED, was talking about community college, had stayed out of trouble long enough that his probation officer had stopped expecting him to fail. "You saved my life," Marcus said to Carter during a quiet moment. "You and Wade and that horse. We didn't save you." Carter's voice was firm but not unkind. "You saved yourself. We just gave you a place to do it." Marcus nodded slowly, processing that. "Then I guess that's what this place is. A place where people can save themselves." "Yeah, that's exactly what it is." After everyone left, Carter walked down to the barn for his nightly check. Goliath was in his stall, dozing in the warm glow of the overhead lights. The horse's ears flicked toward Carter's footsteps, but he didn't open his eyes. Carter let himself into the stall and sat down in the straw. His knee protested, his back ached, and he was 59 years old, feeling like 70. But he was here, still sober, still fighting, still proving every day that broken men could build something worth keeping. "You know what I figured out?" Carter spoke quietly. "That day I found you chained to the tree, I thought I was saving you. Thought I was the hero in that story." Goliath's ear flickered toward his voice. "But I was wrong. You were saving me, giving me something worth staying sober for, worth getting up every morning for, worth fighting for when fighting seemed pointless." Carter leaned back against the stall wall. "Everything that happened after, all of it, started because you refused to quit, because you kept breathing even when dying would have been easier." The horse opened one amber eye and looked at him. "So thank you for choosing to live, for trusting me when you had no reason to, for showing all these broken people that healing's possible." Carter's voice roughened. "For giving me a second chance I didn't deserve." Goliath shifted, lowering his great head until it rested in Carter's lap. They sat like that for a long time, man and horse, both of them scarred by their pasts. Both of them proof that survival was just the beginning. The spring after that brought changes. Marcus graduated from the program, no longer needed weekly sessions, but stopped by sometimes just to visit. The veteran with PTSD completed his year of therapy and started volunteering, helping other vets who were walking the same dark road he'd traveled. The 12-year-old girl spoke her first words in 18 months, whispered them to Goliath during a session, then gradually found her voice with people too. Wade proposed expanding, adding more horses, serving more clients. Carter was hesitant, worried about growing too fast and losing the personal connection that made the program work. But Sarah pointed out that there were hundreds of broken people in Wyoming alone, thousands across the country, and turning them away because they were afraid of success was just another form of quitting. They expanded carefully, added staff, all of them people who understood brokenness from the inside, created a training program for volunteers, established partnerships with mental health facilities and addiction treatment centers. The ranch grew from serving 10 clients a month to 20, then 40. And through it all, Goliath remained at the center, not because he was magical or special in any supernatural sense, but because he was the symbol they'd all rallied around, the living embodiment of the idea that chains could be broken wounds could heal, and second chances were real if you were willing to fight for them. 2 years after starting the program, Carter received a phone call from a woman he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. His ex-wife reaching out through a number he'd forgotten he'd given her, asking if they could meet. They sat in a coffee shop in town, both of them older and carrying their own scars. She looked tired but stable, had remarried, was working as a paralegal in Cheyenne. They talked carefully, like people navigating a minefield, avoiding the explosive topics that had destroyed them the first time. "I heard about what you're doing," she said. "The ranch, the therapy program," her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "It's good, what you've built." Trying to make up for lost time, she shook her head. "You can't make up for it. Kelly's gone. What happened, happened. But you can honor her memory by helping other kids not make her choice." Carter thought about Marcus and the 12-year-old girl and all the others who'd come through the ranch carrying wounds that might have killed them if left untreated. "Is that what this is, honoring Kelly?" "I think so." She paused. "I came because I wanted to tell you I'm sorry for not believing you. About the abuse case, the student you tried to protect. You were right, and I chose the system over you. That was wrong." The apology landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples Carter didn't know how to interpret. He'd spent years blaming her for abandoning him. Years believing that if she'd just trusted him, believed in him, maybe things would have been different. But sitting here now, looking at this woman who'd been broken by the same loss that broke him, he realized something. Forgiveness wasn't about deserving, it was about letting go. "I wasn't exactly easy to believe in," he said, drunk more often than sober, angry at the world, not much of a husband or father. "We both made mistakes." "Yeah, we did." They talked for another hour, circling around their shared grief, neither one trying to resurrect what had died years ago. When they parted, it wasn't with promises to stay in touch or fantasies of reconciliation. Just two people acknowledging their shared past and releasing each other from it. Carter drove back to the ranch feeling lighter than he had in years. The past would always be there, would always carry weight. But maybe that weight didn't have to crush you. Maybe you could carry it and keep moving forward anyway. 5 years after finding Goliath chained to that tree, Carter stood on the porch of the main house and watched the sun set over the ranch. The facility had grown to include 4 barns, 12 horses, and a full-time staff of 8. They were serving over 100 clients a month, had a waiting list that stretched 6 months, and a reputation that brought people from across the region. Wade had become the lead therapist, had gotten certified in equine-assisted therapy and trauma counseling. He'd paid off his debt to Chen in full, had 3 years of continuous sobriety from gambling, had rebuilt his life into something that mattered. Maria had achieved permanent residency and brought her daughter up from Mexico. The girl, 14 now, volunteered at the ranch after school, working with the horses with the same quiet competence her mother brought to everything. Sarah had semi-retired from veterinary practice to focus full-time on the ranch, served as medical director and unofficial spiritual advisor. She led a prayer group on Sunday mornings for anyone who wanted it, never pushing, but always available. And Goliath, now 14 years old, had become something of a legend. Articles had been written about the horse that shouldn't have survived. Television crews had visited. People drove hundreds of miles just to see him, to touch the animal that represented hope in its purest form. But to Carter, he was still just Goliath. The horse with amber eyes who'd asked if Carter was there to help or to watch him die. The horse who'd chosen to trust despite every reason not to. The horse who'd saved Carter's life by letting Carter save his. That evening, after the last client had left and the volunteers had gone home, Carter walked down to the barn for his nightly ritual. Goliath was waiting in his stall, head over the door, watching Carter's approach with patient intelligence. "Evening," Carter said. The horse nickered softly. Carter led himself into the stall and sat down in his usual spot, back against the wall, Goliath's presence solid and real beside him. The barn was quiet, just the sound of horses breathing and the wind moving through the rafters. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Carter spoke into the comfortable silence. "About how many times I could have quit, should have quit, probably. That first day when I found you, I almost walked away, almost decided it wasn't my problem." Goliath's ear flicked toward him. "And when Frank gave me 3 days to save you, I almost gave up. Seemed impossible. You were too far gone, I was too broke. The whole situation was too hard. But I kept going anyway. Not because I thought I'd succeed, but because I couldn't stand the thought of you dying alone." Carter paused, Memories washing over him, Frank testing him, Wade showing up with legal papers, Chen threatening everything, the court case, the sacrifice of giving Goliath back. Every moment when quitting would have been easier than continuing. And here we are, 5 years later. You're healthy, I'm sober. We've helped hundreds of people find their way back from the edge, built something that matters, something that'll outlast both of us. Goliath shifted, lowered his massive head until it rested against Carter's shoulder. Frank told me to make it count, Carter continued, to turn this ranch into something worth keeping. I think we did that. I think he'd be proud. Carter's voice went quiet. I think Kelly would be too. Can't save her. Can't go back and answer that phone call. But maybe saving others is how I honor her memory. They sat in silence for a while, man and horse, both of them older now, both carrying scars that would never fully heal. But the scars were proof of survival, evidence that they'd faced death and refused it, that they'd been broken and found ways to piece themselves back together. You taught me something, Carter said finally. That redemption isn't a destination. It's a choice you make every single day, to show up, to do the work, and to help others even when you're still broken yourself. Goliath's breathing was steady, rhythmic, the sound that had sustained Carter through countless dark nights. Thank you, Carter whispered, for everything. He stayed in the stall until the stars came out, until the temperature dropped and his knees started protesting the cold. When he finally stood to leave, Goliath watched him with those amber eyes that had seen him at his worst and somehow still trusted him. Carter walked back to his cabin, the same trailer he'd lived in for 6 years now, too stubborn to move into the main house even though Maria kept insisting it made more sense. The structure was still drafty, still leaked heat, still reminded him every morning of where he'd started and how far he'd come. He made coffee and sat on the steps, looking up at the Wyoming sky painted with stars. 59 years old, 6 years sober, owner of a ranch that had become something more than land, director of a program that had helped hundreds of people find hope when hope seemed impossible. It wasn't the life he'd planned, wasn't the life he'd expected when he was young and teaching seemed like a noble calling. But it was his life, built from rubble and mistakes and the stubborn refusal to quit even when quitting made sense. Carter pulled out his AA chip, 6 years now, and turned it over in his fingers. The bronze was worn completely smooth from handling, from all the times he'd needed its weight to remind him what he was fighting for. Still here, he said to the night sky. Still sober, still fighting, still proving broken men can build something worth keeping. Somewhere in the barn, Goliath shifted in his stall, settling in for the night. The sound carried on the wind, a reminder that Carter wasn't alone in this, that he'd never been alone. Not since the day he'd found a dying horse chained to a tree and decided that some things were worth saving no matter the cost. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. The mountains stood silent witness, unchanged by human drama. The ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, animals sleeping, buildings creaking, the land breathing in that slow way land breathes when people finally let it rest. And Carter Wright, former drunk, failed father, man who'd lost everything that mattered and somehow found a way to build something new from the ashes, allowed himself something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He allowed himself peace, not the peace of forgetting, not the peace of being absolved from his failures, but the peace that came from knowing he'd done his best, had shown up every day, had refused to quit when quitting was the easy choice, had turned his second chance into second chances for others. That was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all any of them had, the choice to keep going, the choice to help others keep going, the choice to believe that today didn't have to be like yesterday and tomorrow might be better than today. Carter finished his coffee as the temperature dropped toward freezing. He should go inside, get warm, maybe try to sleep. But he sat there a little longer, looking at the ranch that was his responsibility, his legacy, his redemption. Frank's words echoed in his memory. Make it count. Make it all count. He had. God help him, he had. And tomorrow he'd wake up and do it again. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one refusal to quit at a time. Because that's what broken men did when they found something worth fighting for. They fought. And sometimes if they fought hard enough and long enough and refused to surrender even when surrender seemed inevitable, they won. Not the big dramatic victory, just the quiet victory of still being here, still trying, still proving that second chances were real. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of snow from the mountains. Winter was coming again, the way it always did in Wyoming. But Carter had survived 5 winters on this ranch already. He'd survive this one too. Because Goliath had taught him the most important lesson of all. You keep breathing, you keep fighting, you keep choosing to live even when dying would be easier. And eventually, if you're stubborn enough and lucky enough and refuse to quit long enough, you find something worth living for. Carter stood, joints protesting, and walked into his trailer. The heat was still broken, the walls still leaked, the whole structure still needed replacing. But it was home. Had been for 6 years, would be for however many more he had left. He climbed into bed, pulled the worn blankets up, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new clients with new wounds, new problems that needed solving, new opportunities to fail or succeed. But tonight, he was 60 years old and sober and owner of a ranch that saved lives. Tonight, that was enough. The last thing Carter heard before sleep took him was the sound of horses in the barn. Goliath and the others, breathing steady, alive, proof that broken things could heal if given time and care, and the stubborn refusal to give up. In the darkness, Carter smiled, and slept the sleep of men who'd earned their rest.